Hello everyone! Today we're diving into some gripping stories of caving and cave diving incidents that took a wrong turn. By popular demand, we've also included a few tales of horrible fates. Thank you for tuning in. Let's jump right in. Three years after the world-famous Tam Luang cave rescue in Thailand, a monk named Phra Adran Manas entered Tam Phra Sainyam, or the Cave of the Monk, to pray. He entered the cave alone. He wasn't a skilled caver, and he wasn't equipped with the proper gear. Then, a storm swept through the sky, flooding the cave from all of its entrances, and Thailand cavers joined forces to rescue him. Could rescuers reach him in time? And would any unlucky cavers die trying to save him? Find out as we follow the story of the rescue inside the Cave of the Monk. Before we dive into the video, I want to take a moment to thank all of you who have subscribed to this channel. Our subscriber rate has grown from 8% to 13%, which is truly amazing. If you're new here, simply click the subscribe button, like this video, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. Now let's get into the video. Tam Phra Sainyam is located beneath the massive Tung Sulang Luyang National Park, which covers over 480 square miles of gorgeous forests. The park opens to a vast savanna with tree-spotted plateaus that are home to 110 different species of birds. The park has campgrounds and other hiking attractions like the Sidit Waterfall and the Kang Sofa Waterfall, and it's situated above rocky ground containing slate and limestone, making it the perfect place for caves to form. Thanks to these conditions, Thailand's longest cave, the Tam Phra Wang Deng, is also found beneath this park. The tall, mountain-like plateaus in the park are actually formed by tectonic activity. They're considered karstic formations, like the structures found inside caves. The natural beauty of these landmarks was threatened by mining activities for a time, until the Thai government recognized that the caves had significant cultural value, and rules were enacted to protect the caves. Tam Phra Sainyam roughly translates to the Cave of the Monk owning the nice side tree. One of its entrances is located next to a small temple against the side of a cliff. This entrance is a resurgence, which means water from the upstream Tam Dao River exits from the cave system at this hole in the rock. During some parts of the year, the broader cave system can't be accessed from the Cave of the Monk because the water flowing out of the resurgence is too strong. One day, the subject of this story, Phra Manas, walked across the deck and climbed down a bamboo ladder to enter the cave through the resurgence, otherwise known as the fossil entrance, a craggy hole in the side of the plateau. This entrance connects directly to the main subterranean stream that cuts through the cave. Inside its foreboding mouth, the Cave of the Monk has a large chamber with dripping stalactites and smooth waves of rock looming overhead. The floor is full of pebbles and sand in this first section. Downstream, the water has had less time to alter the shape of the cave, so large boulders dot the ground instead of small stones. The water here is stagnant, and small holes in the floor can sneak up on unsuspecting adventurers. These passages open into tall vertical sections where erosion created new pathways down into the main stream. The cave then connects to a sandy floor with low ceilings where cavers have to crawl to exit the Cave of the Monk. Like his forefathers before him, Phra Manas walked through the damp cave further into the darkness. For centuries, Buddhist monks have ventured into caves to meditate. The practice of meditation is all about focusing the mind, so caves provide tranquil locations that are isolated from the outside world. Their all-encompassing darkness is terrifying to most people. Cave tours will occasionally turn off the lights to show visitors how soul-crushing and disorienting total darkness can really be. But monks like Manas welcome the darkness because it enhances their meditation. Phra Manas doesn't reside at the local temple outside the Cave of the Monk. Instead, he takes a pilgrimage to the cave every year in April. The local villagers knew Manas and welcomed his arrival. They fed him and asked him to impart any spiritual knowledge he had uncovered from the year prior. The next morning, on Saturday, April 3rd, 2021, Manas found a quiet alcove away from the main stream and began his meditation. As he sat, focusing his mind, freeing his brain of all thought, a nagging sound kept hitting his ears and pulling him out of his trance. The sounds grew louder until he could no longer ignore them. He rose to find the water of the subterranean river was rising, and fast. Outside, a thunderstorm had rolled over the savannah and stagnated. Without winds to carry away the swirling clouds, the storm drenched the park, and the waters ran swiftly across the stony ground directly into Tam Phra Sanyam. Since this cave is a resurgent for an underground river, water could flow into the cave from both ends. The entrance that Phra Manas used to get into the cave was being flooded from the outside, while the saturated river sent torrents of water through the cave directly toward his location. Manas looked around in shock as the water surged toward him from both sides. But to his horror, there were more dangers to deal with. Water from tall avens, or potholes, rained on him from above, flooding the cave from a third direction. As the moon rose behind the violent clouds, the villagers noticed that Phra Manas hadn't returned from his meditations. They immediately called the police and rescue services. The local Prasat Ban Saitan cave rescue team was the first to arrive within hours of the call. They immediately began assessing the situation. They quickly geared up and went into the cave, but after only an hour of searching, they had to turn around. The waters were getting too extreme, even for those pros. The fossil or resurgence entrance was blocked by the rains. That meant the upstream route would likely be blocked as well. They checked just to be sure, and like they suspected, the waters flowing into the cave were high enough to completely flood the cave at this end. Even the other major exit, which was further away, was also blocked by the waters exiting the cave. Police and firefighters arrived, but they couldn't do anything yet. The next day, the storm showed no signs of stopping. More rescue crews from all across Thailand were arriving. They were all passionate and eager to help the stranded 46-year-old monk, but their hands were tied. Eventually, military personnel arrived, and they considered blasting the third exit to open a wider resurgence. This would divert the stream away from the area where Manas had entered, and it could lower the waters enough for cavers to get inside. But since the cave is considered sacred, many of the cavers protested these drastic measures, even though it could cost the traveling monk his life. Shortly after the rains began their unceasing deluge, the stranded monk fled his secluded spot. To get to safety, he would have to run alongside the river as it crashed along the rocks, splashing over the ground as it rose higher and higher. Even though Manas wasn't an expert caver, he had been here many times, so he avoided the pitfalls and sprinted across the rocky floor. Then, he summoned all of his strength and climbed to a higher ledge around a quarter-mile from the entrance. The rising waters continuously struck terror into the monk 24/7, but the ever-present threat of drowning wasn't his only problem. As part of his monk training, Manas was only allowed to eat twice a day, and he couldn't eat after 12 noon. Monks in Thailand generally practice Theravada Buddhism, which allows them to eat meat, though some will choose to stick to a vegetarian or even a vegan diet if possible. However, many monks in Thailand rely solely on donations to survive. That means they have little choice of what they eat or even how much they can eat every day, since donations are divided among the other monks. It's safe to say Manas was more at risk of starvation than even an average unprepared caver. Usually, cavers will bring some food, like energy bars or trail mix with them, but Manas was alone in the dark, and his hunger was consuming him. On top of all his other struggles, Manas faced another unique threat only found in caves deep underground. There were no lights deep below the Thailand park. The cold was numbing his limbs, making it hard to feel, and the sound of the water became almost hypnotic. Short-term exposure to total darkness can be relaxing, but as hours turned to days, Manas may have been experiencing sensory deprivation. Sensory deprivation occurs when the body has little to no sensory input. In short intervals, sensory deprivation might have therapeutic potential. That's why Manas was here to begin with, and why thousands of people all over the world elected to seal themselves in metal chambers or flotation devices. but extended time in a low-stimulus environment can cause hallucinations, severe anxiety, and even long-lasting depression. Manas might have journeyed into the cave of the monk to find peace in his mind, but now his mind was tortured, just like prisoners stuck in solitary confinement. In extreme cases, total darkness and sensory deprivation was even used to torture and interrogate enemies of war. In some ways, Manas faced even worse conditions than those stuck in a small cage. The rising waters created a panic that lasted for days. He couldn't adapt to his situation. Every step could be another puddle, a fast-moving river, or a bottomless hole that would crush him in a violent death. The delusions brought on by his total isolation began to sway even his hardened mind. Suddenly, flashes of light danced in the periphery of Manas's vision. He stood up quickly, the blood rushing from his brain, leaving him more lightheaded. He stumbled toward the lights, but they vanished. These lights were like mirages found in the desert, and they were caused by the sensory deprivation he was experiencing. The waters were still too severe for anyone to safely enter the cave from any direction. Rescuers could only wait with the villagers until the rain let up. By Tuesday, the rescue team ballooned as hundreds of people gathered to figure out how to save the stranded monk. Many feared by this point it was most likely a recovery mission for his body. The rain flooded into the cave for not 1, not 2, but 4 days straight. Miraculously, by the 4th day, on Wednesday, the rain finally slowed to a halt. However, some of the cave's entrances were totally submerged in water. 17 rescuers scrambled their diving gear and went into the cave at the resurgence. 50 feet beyond the entrance, they found a flooded sump that led deeper into the cave. This area was totally submerged. If the monk was caught in this divot, he was surely gone. They each strapped into their scuba gear and swam into the murky waters of the cave of the monk. The rescuers deftly maneuvered through the perilous tunnels and surfaced on the other side. This time, the light Manas saw shining in the waters didn't disappear when he blinked. The rescuers found him. They checked his vitals and saw that he was delirious, but still capable of moving. They gave him a respirator and scuba mask to see underwater, tightened a harness around his waist, and hooked their own ropes to his harness. If the monk lost consciousness or got disoriented, the ropes would ensure he couldn't go too far, and the crew would know exactly how to find him. Some members kept hands on him throughout the swimming portion of the cave until he surfaced on the other side. A short walk later, and Fra Manas was outside in the fresh air once again. Paramedics checked his vitals as cameras flocked to take photos of the miracle. The monk could walk, but he was still taken to a hospital to recover from the cold. In the safety of the hospital, he could rehydrate and get some much-needed meals before returning to his own monastery and his quiet life as a monk. Thailand keeps making headlines with shocking rescue stories that narrowly avoided tragedy. Sacred or not, Thailand's caves are deadly traps waiting to ensnare unsuspecting visitors who boldly travel in the hellish world buried beneath the Earth's surface. In 1995, a group of 8 trained divers gathered in Tulum, Mexico for an exciting day of cave diving. They submerged below Tulum into the underwater caverns and traveled through the columns and walls of limestone. By the end of the day, only 5 divers would make it back to the surface alive. The peninsula of Yucatan, located in the southern region of Mexico, is home to over 6,000 cenotes, caves filled with crystal clear water. Because of its beauty and proximity to the Caribbean coast, they've become a major tourist destination, attracting divers from around the world, beginners and experienced alike. The name cenote comes from the Mayan language, meaning water well. These wells were considered vital and sacred to the Mayan people. They were a source of water, a source of life. The Mayans also used them as a portal to speak to the gods. In fact, the skeletal remains of over 120 people were found in one cenote alone, although it is unknown when and how they died. The cenotes connect to an underground cave system, a labyrinth of kilometers-long tunnels. All of these systems, at some point, connect to the sea. This provides the cenotes with a mix of both fresh water from rainfalls and salt water from the ocean. The zone in which fresh and salt water meet is known as a halocline. It creates a murky and dense blur that distorts a diver's view. Diving into the caverns of a cenote is what's known as cave diving. It's classified as an overhead environment dive, meaning there's structures above you. This differs from standard scuba diving or open water diving, in which all you need to do is travel up to surface. In overhead environment dives, you have to either go forward, go backward, or hope that there's a sliver of an air pocket in the case you run into trouble. It requires different types of equipment. This difference is what makes cave diving so dangerous, especially for those not trained in it. Once you begin your dive into the cenotes of Yucatan, you're given a choice. You can stay within the limits of the cavern lines, which are permanent rope guidelines, or you can travel further into the cave system. If you choose to travel beyond the main cavern limits, there is a chance you may not make it back to the surface. The summer of 1995 was a busy one for Maria and her husband Harry. Their dive shop in Cozumel, Mexican divers, had received several calls looking for a guided tour of the Yucatan cenotes. They began planning the logistics of such a tour. Though they were trained open water divers, Maria and Harry had no experience in cave diving. They decided to hire a guide, or dive master, local to the area they would explore, Tulum. They found Juan, an open water instructor. He agreed to take the group to two of his favorite cenotes that he was familiar with. With a tour guide in place and the diving location set, all that was left to do was wait. On August 17th, the group of 8 divers met at Gran Cenote, 5 kilometers north of the town of Tulum. Along with Harry, Maria, and Juan were 3 Dutch, an Italian, and an American woman. Though trained in open water, none were certified for cave diving. The divers strapped on their equipment, jumped into the open mouth of the cave's entrance, and traveled into the clear, blue waters below. The waters were warm and the depths relatively shallow. The group was filled with excitement. They were diving in such a place of beauty. This may have been the most beautiful dive they had been on their entire life. Juan had made this happen. They respected their dive master and placed their trust in him. After spending almost an hour at Gran Cenote, they were ready for their next dive. Just south of Gran Cenote was Cenote Calavera, or the Temple of Doom. The group piled out of their taxis and approached the entrance. In front of them was what looked like a giant skull, a large mouth-like entrance with 2 smaller holes behind. After a resupply and re-equip, they began. One by one, they jumped into the mouth of the skull and down into the water below. Looking back, they saw the sun shine through the openings, a beautiful sight underwater. A ladder, which looked like it had been put there by the Mayans themselves, was the only exit. Juan led the group of 8 through the main section of the cenote. Harry took up the rear. The main section is a large 360-degree area, a radius of around 366 meters. The floor reaches a depth of 14 meters. Many tourists and even experienced divers stay within the cavern limits, but Juan had other plans. As they traversed further into the caverns, they became surrounded by limestone walls and columns dripping from ceiling to floor. This was no open water dive. Juan led them further. They traveled into the Madonna Passage, a tunnel leading to the kilometers-long cave system. The tunnel was past the main caverns, past the guidelines, and past the sign. The sign reading, "Stop, prevent your death, go no further." They were not far into the passage when Harry, moved by panic or premonition, retreated back to the entrance. None of the other 7 noticed he was gone. Juan, despite his responsibility, never looked back. The further they went, the colder it got and the harder it became to see due to dwindling light and halocline interference. All the while, their oxygen supply was continually decreasing. The group continued swimming. They were beginning to panic, frightened by the diminishing oxygen, unsure if they were being led on an adventure or led to their death. After several minutes in the passage, Juan finally looked back at the group and noticed that only 3 divers were left with him. They were low on oxygen. He himself was low on oxygen. Harry waited at the entrance for his wife and the others. It seemed like hours had passed. Should he go back down? Then a diver resurfaced. It was the Italian, then 2 more, Dutch divers, then a third, Juan. Without explaining, Juan took Harry's partially full tank and traveled back down to the passage. Every second mattered. He swam through the main cavern, through the columns and walls, arriving at the signs. At the entrance, he saw that the seconds no longer mattered. 2 divers out of air, 2 divers dead. There was no more hope for them. He knew there was 1 left. He traveled further down the passage, and between the walls he found them. The 3rd diver, it was Maria. She was out of air, but still alive. Harry was now outside the entrance, fearing that his wife was gone. He continued looking back at the ladder leading into the skull's mouth. Waiting. The minutes continued to pass by when the splash of a diver surfacing caused Harry to rush to the opening. Juan, the ladder, carrying Maria. She was not breathing. He quickly pulled off her equipment and began CPR. A vehicle arrived to rush Maria to the Red Cross station in Tulum. There was hope, but Juan was seconds too late for Maria too. She was pronounced dead at the station. Juan retrieved the bodies of the other 2 divers, one of the Dutch tourists and the American woman. The death of 3 divers lay in the hands of an untrained dive master. Juan was never charged with a crime, though many believe his actions should be considered manslaughter. He took a group of divers into dangerous caverns without the proper equipment and without the proper training. The deaths led to pain and anger throughout the Yucatan Peninsula. Dive shop owners and instructors in Yucatan and Cozumel were outraged by the incompetence of Juan. How could he lead this group knowing he wasn't properly trained? They were moved to action. They formed an association to develop a list of safety policies and procedures for diving in the cenotes. Those policies have influenced the training and practices of instructors and shops throughout the area. This story is unfortunately not unique. So many divers have suffered the same fate underwater, especially in the cenotes of Yucatan, where divers, many untrained and inexperienced, continue to lose their lives to this day. The number 1 cause of death for cave diving is suffocation, which amounts to 2 things: improper gear and improper training. Lechuguilla Cave is one of the most intimidating caves in the United States, and one of the most beautiful. That's why a special team of scientists went to explore the cave in 1991, but they came face to face with death when one of their members suffered a terrible accident over 1,000 feet below ground. Today, we dare to journey into the depths to explore the shocking rescue operation of Emily Mobley. Lechuguilla is a world-famous cave. It's the 2nd deepest cave in the United States with a max depth of over 1,600 feet. That's deeper than the Empire State Building is tall. The cave is also the 8th longest in the world, stretching 150 grueling miles in the damp black abyss. Lechuguilla is located near the New Mexican city of Carlsbad, which was first founded by people immigrating to the U.S. looking to stake their name in new territory, not unlike the story of cavers on the frontier beneath us. Since then, Carlsbad has become a mining town and the tourist destination for outdoor enthusiasts looking to visit Carlsbad National Park. This national park is located in the Guadalupe Mountains, and it's home to the Carlsbad Cavern System, which is a world-class cave nearby Lechuguilla. Carlsbad Cavern is most known for its big room, which is 255 feet tall, 625 feet wide, and 4,000 feet long, making it the largest cave chamber in the U.S. and North America. Lechuguilla itself is run by the National Park Service, which is a federal agency that's tasked with preserving and managing natural historic sites, protecting the ecosystem of these sites, and ensuring safe access to the public. Lechuguilla Cave was first used as a mine for bat guano in 1914. Bat guano develops over years from bat droppings, and it was used as fertilizer back in the old days. In the early days, the cave's most infamous feature was Misery Hole, which dropped 90 feet into the darkness before opening up into a 400 feet labyrinth below ground. This part of the cave was mostly terminal, so the cave was thought to be small. That was until cavers in the 1950s heard a sound. A deep, bellowing wind started howling from beneath their feet. The cavers realized that the floor was actually a pile of boulders and rubble that had accumulated over the mouth of a different entrance. It took over 30 years before a team got permission from the U.S. National Park Service to dig in Lechuguilla. Shortly after they began excavating the ruined chamber, they broke through and found an entrance that stretched beyond the shadows. During the exploration phase of Lechuguilla, cavers found a vast array of incredible karst formations and speleothems, which are the unique geological formations found in caves including soda straws, gypsum beards and chandeliers, cave pearls, and more. These structures were formed by sulfuric acid that seeped into Lechuguilla after undergoing chemical reactions from oil deposits near the cave. Unlike caves formed from water erosion, sulfuric acid formation is brutal. It is one of the strongest acids, and it can eat through practically anything, which adds a sinister vibe to the cave. If any caver accidentally stumbled upon sulfuric acid deposits, they'd meet a gruesome end more vile than any cave death ever recorded. Even a few drops falling from the ceiling could melt through helmets and lobotomize would-be adventurers. Luckily, this death trap is highly unlikely, but stranger things have happened in the world beneath the surface. In 2012, Colorado surveyor, member of the Cave Research Foundation, and cave vlogger Derek Bristol led a team through Lechuguilla to map uncharted territory. Braving the depths, Derek and his team climbed 410 feet of unexplored rock to find a 510-foot pit dubbed Kansas Twister, a 600 feet long, 150 feet high chamber. Derek and his team also found many new rooms that they dubbed Oz after the movie The Wizard of Oz. It took the team 8 days underground in low visibility covered in dirt and mud with ever-present danger around every corner to complete this journey. Today, the cave is only accessible to scientific researchers with approval from the National Park Service, because the cave could become deadly at any moment. The same oil deposits that created the sulfuric acid in Lechuguilla are actively being mined and drilled. That means undiscovered access points could be breached, and toxic fumes from natural gas or drilling equipment could quickly fill large sections of Lechuguilla. Any unlucky caver trapped below ground would be poisoned by the fumes and die of carbon monoxide poisoning as they choke on the air itself. Scientists exploring Lechuguilla Cave have discovered rare microbes that could be used for medicine or used in treating diseases. They've also found a rock-eating bacteria known as a chemolithoautotrophic microbe that can dissolve iron and sulfur, which could have formed some of the cave's unique features. These researchers are called surveyors. Surveying is a vital part of caving, but it's also one of the most dangerous. Cave surveyors enter newly discovered or uncharted caves with cartography equipment to create accurate maps of the twisting and turning caverns that lie beneath the soil. Surveyors can be some of the first to place rope anchors, and they pioneer routes for future cavers to explore. This trailblazing nature can lead to accidents and even death. In modern times, surveyors will even use computer scanning methods to create 3D models of caves with more detail than ever before. In April 1991, one National Park Service caving team volunteered to venture into Lechuguilla to survey the cave and perform these exact scientific studies. 40-year-old Emily Mobley was a scientist from New York who traveled to New Mexico to join the 5-person team to explore Lechuguilla. Together, this group was called the Lechuguilla Cave Project, and they took part in the first major survey of the cave less than 10 years prior. Some footholds and rope anchors were set into the stone, but few had ventured into Lechuguilla since then. The team was also tasked with finding new passages in the labyrinth of Lechuguilla. Despite having traversed the cold, damp corridors before that fateful day in April, the team had to stay on their toes since caves are always capable of throwing curveballs. The mind-numbing drip of water echoed around her as she climbed down one of the newly discovered sections of the cave. The stone seemed to be closing in on all sides. Sweat started to pool on her dirt-stained forehead, beading into her eyes in rhythm with the stalactites hanging like sharpened guillotines all around her. In a flash, Emily's hand fell. The rock she had just grabbed to support her weight fully dislodged. With a terrible thunder, a massive boulder broke loose and came crashing into her left leg. Emily's vision went white as agony surged through her body, sending her into shock. Her leg was broken. The femur is one of the largest bones in the body, and the bones near the calf are also large relative to the other bones in our bodies. When these bones break, they cause some of the most intense pain human beings can ever experience. Emily's day went from an exhilarating mission doing what she loved to suddenly staring death in the face as pain encased her like a stone casket. Rescue teams were quickly dispatched. More than 200 people traveled to Lechuguilla to lend their aid in saving Emily's life. In a race against time, the other 4 members of her team got her to stable ground and tried their best to ease her pain. The team was well equipped, so food, warmth, and light were all accounted for. If this cave would be her coffin, she wouldn't be dying from exposure to the elements, not unless she got stuck on the way out. To make sure this didn't happen, the 200-person team did everything they could to widen any narrow passages of the cave. The first day of the rescue was a flurry as teams arrived in droves to set up a base camp outside the cave and plan the quickest and safest route to reach Mobley. Day 2 involved frantically cutting rock and blasting portions of the cave to ensure she could make it out alive. Each time the rescuers needed to alter the cave, they risked a breakdown, a cave-in deep below the sunlight that would spell doom for Emily and any other rescuers trapped on the other side. The teams of rescuers worked in shifts to prevent the nerves from getting to them. They worked with as much precision as they could, but they had to act fast because Emily Mobley was trapped 55 miles away from the entrance to Lechuguilla, 1,565 feet down. The final 2 days were all about transporting Mobley as carefully and as quickly as possible. By this point, the pain had started to subside as her body began trying to heal itself. Mobley's friend, Pat Sizer, stayed by her the whole time to keep her spirits up. The team sent Dr. Steve Mossberg into the cave to stay close and monitor Mobley. Once he reached her, he stabilized her leg with an inflatable splint to prevent her from accidentally moving, which would cause the pain to flare up like a volcanic eruption throughout her whole body. The team created a chain of people to bring Mobley to the surface. At one point, they had to move her overhead like she was crowd surfing in a concert in hell. The whole team was on edge emotionally and literally when they had to get her up a 185-foot-tall pitch. Thanks to the careful planning and swift execution of the team, they got her to the next section of the cave. During the final stretch, Emily stayed awake for over 30 hours, her fatigue mixed with her pain to send her near the edge of delirium like drunkenly staring into an unknown pit deep within a nightmare. But as she neared the surface, she began to realize where she was. The entrance to Lechuguilla was all too familiar. Knowing that she was close to safety, she overcame the pain. She overcame her fatigue, and she started to sing, "Are the Stars Out Tonight?" 15 minutes after midnight on the fourth day, Emily was brought out of the cave alive. The above-ground camp of 200 brave rescuers gave Emily a warm reception. 31 pizzas had been donated to the rescuers, and they saved a whole one just for her. It turns out, Mobley was stronger than any boulder. While she was trapped below ground, all she wanted was a pizza and some margaritas. Fellow potholers and emergency personnel applauded her indomitable spirit for the brief time she was there before an ambulance whisked her away. Seeing her lifted spirits, her team with the Lechuguilla Cave Project was undeterred. They returned to the cave just days later to wrap up their survey while Emily Mobley prepped for surgery in a nearby hospital. After she recovered, Mobley continued to be a part of the caving community throughout her working life. She dedicated her life to making sure people are safe in caves by educating people all around the country. During the Tam Long Cave incident, Mobley was closely watching the rescue operations, and in its early stages, she lent her expertise to reports and expressed how difficult the operation would be. If you want more frightening cave stories, we released a video detailing all the harrowing events of the Thailand cave rescue, so check that out next. That's the incredible story of Emily Mobley, who faced death and made it out alive from the deep, dark recesses of Lechuguilla Cave. A school nature trip turned into a battle for survival deep beneath the ground in Australia's Mystery Creek Cave. This is a story of survival, of heartbreak, and a warning for anyone who tries to battle against nature. Mystery Creek Cave. Mystery Creek Cave is located near the city of Hobart in Tasmania's Ida Bay. The cave was first recorded by a pair known as the Tyler brothers in 1880. Discovery of the cave led prospectors to find huge amounts of limestone nearby, and soon massive quarries were being constructed close to Mystery Creek. These mines threatened to turn Mystery Creek Cave and all its delicate and unique wildlife into a square void in the earth. The Tasmanian government stepped in to protect Mystery Creek Cave from the far-reaching laws of Australia's Mining Act. However, that didn't stop companies from digging nearby. In 1920, construction began on Blaney's Quarry, and even though Mystery Creek was a protected area, massive subterranean explosion shook the earth in a huge blast radius beyond the quarry itself. Some of Mystery Creek's delicate karstic tunnels collapsed from the blasts, and the cave entrance was temporarily caved in. Around this time, a large railroad was built to haul rubble and precious minerals away from the quarry. After the main entrance was excavated, the Tasmanian Caverneering Club embarked on the first true expedition to Mystery Creek Cave in 1954. Intrigued by what they found, the cavers started using the train to travel to Mystery Creek more often. People from Hobart and all around Tasmania started to get curious about the cave as well. So they also started taking excursions by train to the countryside, where they'd hike along a trail and marvel at the beauty of Mystery Creek Cave. The entrance of the cave attracted visitors with its generously sized interior that gets enough light in the daytime to give hikers a taste of what caving has to offer. Deeper inside, Mystery Creek Cave dips into a neck-high river that cavers have to wade through before the cave opens into hazardous passages with a 65-foot-deep chasm that lacks anchor points and ropes, so people have to shuffle along the walls and step over the cracks, praying not to slip. Piles of boulders present a climbing challenge that could give way to a landslide with one wrong move. Past a smooth sailing section that looks like it was made to be a reward for cavers, Mystery Creek shrinks into the Matchbox Squeeze. 50 feet of crawling through 5-foot-tall passages that are only just wide enough for the average person to squeeze through. The next path takes you under the Midnight Hole, a cylindrical shaft that opens up into another smaller cave entrance for cavers who like pitches and rappelling. Scientists have also had their eyes on Mystery Creek Cave for a while. They found that water flowing through the small Mystery Creek Cave connects to the much larger Exit Cave system, one of the largest cave systems in Australia that extends for 9.3 miles. Unfortunately for cavers, the connections aren't large enough for humans to traverse. Together, these two caves form a subterranean drainage network between the Mystery Creek River and the d'Entrecasteaux River. Most of Mystery Creek is composed of very old Ordovician limestone, which is stronger and less absorbent than other types of limestone, while the bulk of Exit Cave is comprised of Carboniferous stone, which is permeable, which allows water to erode it to form caves. That's why Mystery Creek Cave is small, even though it's an inlet, and Exit Cave is enormous. Mystery Cave, Exit Cave, and other nearby caves represent the Ida Bay Cave Collection, which has some of the most diverse species and some of the rarest species in all of Australia. Mystery Creek is home to blind cave beetles, terrestrial troglobites, and the main attraction, glowworms, small insects that use bioluminescence to glow bright blue, which definitely makes the cave feel mysterious and otherworldly. These days, the old railroad tracks are gone, the quarry is closed, and nature trails were created that extend 1.4 miles to the cave. The Mystery Creek Trail continues to be a popular place for tourists and even school trips. But over the years, many novice cavers or foolhardy campers have gone too deep into Mystery Creek Cave. Some of these trips have turned to nightmares. Heroism, hubris, and hell inside Mystery Creek Cave. The mouth of the cave is a huge 164-foot chamber with a gently flowing stream and smooth rocks along the ground. The walls arc and bend upward with roughly a 50-foot ceiling in some places. This huge entrance can easily trick people into a false sense of security. The left wall heads off the straight path with a smooth karst formation before splitting with the right wall to form a narrow passageway that leads into the proper spelunking portion of the cave. At this divide, a relatively new sign was drilled into the stone, the final warning to anyone who reads it. Unfortunately, at the time of this story, that sign wasn't there. Back in the summer of 1990, a group of 11 people were wrapping up their week-long camp with a trip to Mystery Creek Cave. The group was a class visiting the area from Taroona High School in Tasmania's capital city, Hobart. On July 2nd, the class trip left their camp and journeyed into Mystery Creek Cave. 8 students in their early teens were led by a caver who was a teacher at the school, accompanied by one other teacher, a female swimmer and water athlete, and another woman who worked as a student teacher. The teachers worked alongside local educators to give the kids a crash course in caving. They taught the basics of how their gear functioned, how to navigate, and emergency procedures. They were fully suited up with helmets and both wetsuits and overalls. Their lights weren't ideal though. Many of them used flashlights or other handheld light sources, while the team lead and a few others had headlamps. The weather that day was nasty, with record rainfall drenching nearby cities. But this was in the day before the internet was mainstream, and there were no smartphones to check real-time weather updates. The class had no idea that storms were pouring over nearby towns, since they only experienced light drizzles and mist along the trail. A caver, who was walking in the opposite direction, told them that the water was too deep and flowing too fast for him. The rain started to let up as they pressed onward, so the group agreed to decide what to do once they entered the cave. They reached the entrance to the cave in the early afternoon and found the water was lower than they expected. At the time, cavers were too relaxed about Mystery Creek. It wasn't the monster of Exit Creek, and it was peanuts compared to the submerged caves dotted all around Australia. Cavers in Tasmania just used a log by the inlet to check how high the water level was inside the cave. The log could be moved by the weather or by people, but that's not the real problem with this method. The real issue is that the water level at the mouth of the cave isn't a perfect measure of the water inside the cave. By the time you figure out the water level's too high, it's probably too late. The water levels returned to normal, and the group progressed further into the cave. They practiced caving maneuvers in sections where there was minimal risk. The students got through the matchbox squeeze without much trouble. They hugged the stone walls for a slab walk, and carefully descended the inclined laundry chute, which dropped in elevation down to the level of the entrance. This final portion was a challenge, so it took the group considerable effort and time to descend. In between helping the various newbie climbers, the veteran of the bunch started to steal concerned looks down at the stream below. 500 feet from the entrance, the group had one last challenge. They had to wade through a section of fast-flowing water roughly 2 feet deep. The party made a human chain and locked arms to cross. One of the classmates slipped. His two partners were unable to hold him up, and he went down hard on the rocks. They managed to get him up and across. He was hurt, but not injured. Then, a girl fell near the middle of the notch where the water was deepest, but this time, the rocks didn't hold her in place. The current whisked her 10 feet away and slammed her into a wall of rocks. She lost consciousness as she started drifting further down the notch. The water here gradually got deeper. Downstream, this underground river eventually ended in a vertical drop, a waterfall. One of the other kids bravely slid across the stones, rushed to her side, and tried to heave her out of the current. He wasn't strong enough, but he used all his might to keep her head above water. The female teacher with a swimming background easily traversed the slippery rocks and caught up with the two students, but they were being carried away by the stream down and out of sight. The team leader rushed to them. As he approached, the three were beginning to slide into a tube of rock that connected to a different portion of the cave. He dove for them as they vanished into the dark tunnel. On the way down, his boot got caught on the rocks. He yanked his foot out and started to run back upstream without it, but the water was gaining on him, and he couldn't get across to the other side where the students were. The student teacher helped coordinate the class, splitting them into two groups. She took 2 students with her, while the remaining 4 students stayed put. Outside the cave, emergency patrols were already out looking for them. The group was over 30 minutes late. Instead of immediately calling for a rescue team, it took first responders over an hour to figure out that the cars that had shuttled the class were still sitting at the start of the trail in the parking lot. Only then did they finally call the Tasmanian Caverneering Club's search and rescue unit. Nearly 3 hours later, 2 rescue cavers and 1 volunteer made it to the cave. The storm had returned in full force by this point, drenching the entire forest. They found some gear belonging to the class near the entrance of Mystery Creek Cave, stuff they didn't need inside the cave, things that they left behind when they entered. But none of the kids or the teachers were anywhere in sight. The impromptu rescue team rigged rope lines across the now raging river inside the early portion of Mystery Creek Cave. It was a challenge even for these experts. But after an hour of slow progress, they found the first classmate from the group of students that stayed behind on the exit side of the notch. By now, the sound of the rushing water reverberated around the dense stone, creating deafening noise that drowned out the voices of rescuers, making it hard to coordinate their plan. They realized that this water was hard to cross even with a rope. They tried not to think about the grim fate lying in wait for anyone who tried to cross it on their own. 2 hours later, the rest of the first group had been located. It was a miracle they found them when they did, because water levels were still rising. The second group, with the student teacher, was closer to the notch, so it took the rescue team longer to reach them. On their way out, the rescuers laid a ladder down across the stream, and the second group had to carefully climb across it since the water was too strong to traverse even with a rope. All 3 people in Group 2 made it out after 4 grueling hours. Both teams were safe, so the rescuers turned their attention to the team's caving guide, the second teacher, and the 2 students who were swept away by the notch. Rescuers attached a rope downstream from where the four had disappeared and tried to battle the river to find them. Further down, the rescuers saw light flickering in the cave. Unable to yell over the water, they slowly approached to find the caving teacher alive and using emergency candles to keep his exposed foot from falling off as he stole a sliver of warmth from the frigid air of the damp cave. He was unable to follow the other three any further due to the rushing waters, but he detailed their last known location and the rescuers brought him out to safety. Rescuers searched as best as they could for 2 more hours, but they were unable to access portions of the cave as well. By 6 a.m., over 20 rescuers and emergency personnel had made it to Mystery Creek. As the students made it home after medical inspections, word spread like wildfire, and news crews descended on Mystery Creek, complicating the mission by distracting rescuers with questions and congesting the roadways. By noon, roughly 19 hours after the 3 went missing, the water in the cave had receded, allowing rescuers free access to the rest of the cave. Within just 3 hours, rescue teams found the teacher and the 2 students, but it was too late. The rescue crews and the class were all aided by psychologists to help them overcome the losses that they suffered that day, but it wasn't enough for the group leader. That teacher was awarded a Medal of Bravery, but he was never the same after that day. A media frenzy tore into him, calling him the worst things imaginable as he lingered in torment, feeling responsible for the deaths of the students. He died 2 months later. Non-cavers might call him reckless for ignoring the signs, but when they reached the cave, the water had gone down, and they had no way of knowing what the weather would bring. Pointing fingers won't bring back the 3 lives lost in that cave. Caving is about science, but it's also about keeping alive the memories of those who died, praising the heroes and rescuers. Caving is about exploring the depths, and it's about lifting people up. If these videos have taught you anything, it's that caves are volatile and unforgiving. Even the safest looking situation can instantly turn into a struggle for life and death. It's impossible to know what the weather or the earth will do. At the end of the day, each and every person who enters the dark labyrinth of a cave does so at their own peril. Should disaster strike, not even the best rescuer or caver in the world can conquer death. That day, when disaster struck, everyone in the class did their best. All the rescuers did their best. And that's all they can do. That's all anyone can ever do. Mystery Creek Cave is a bittersweet reminder about caving's amazing triumphs and its deadly consequences. In 2018, deep underground, a group of explorers, along with a National Geographic cave photographer, find themselves trapped after a cave entrance collapses, with dwindling supplies and freezing temperatures. Will they find a way out before it's too late? Tune in to hear the chilling story of the Veryovkina cave escape. Veryovkina Cave is located in Abkhazia, which is considered part of Georgia by the international community. It holds the title of being the deepest known cave on Earth, plunging down to a depth of 2,223 meters. Situated in the Arabica Massif within the Gagra mountain range of the Western Caucasus, it rests between the Krepost and Zont mountains, near Mount Krepost's slopes. The entrance to the cave sits at an elevation of 2,285 meters above sea level. It features an entrance with dimensions of 3 meters by 4 meters, and the entrance shaft extends downward for 32 meters. Veryovkina Cave is found within limestone rock, which is commonly seen in certain landscapes. Its intricate network of passages, chambers, and vertical shafts was formed over millions of years through geological processes like erosion and dissolution by water. The cave extends to incredible depths where sunlight cannot reach, and the air becomes heavy with the pressure from the earth above. In 1968, the cave was initially called S115, then renamed P17. Eventually, in 1986, it was named after Alexander Verevkin, a cave explorer and cave diver. Verevkin tragically passed away in 1983 while exploring a siphon in Suakan Cave, situated in the Tsaritala Massif, now in Kabardino-Balkaria, Russia. Exploring Veryovkina Cave is tough for cavers. They have to squeeze through narrow passages, climb up steep shafts using ropes and gear, and deal with the physical and mental challenges of being underground for a long time. The cave's pathways are like a confusing maze, with sharp rocks, tight spaces, and dangerous drops. Inside, the air feels heavy and old, with hardly any oxygen, and it gets really cold. It's a tough test for anyone's endurance. The cave is always changing, with floods, falling rocks, and earthquakes making it risky for explorers. Only the bravest and most adventurous dare to go inside, knowing they might not make it out again. Robbie Shawn, a National Geographic cave photographer, embarked on a risky expedition in September 2018. Along with his photo assistant, Jeff Wade, both from Britain but living in Austria and France, they joined forces with a Russian team to explore and photograph Veryovkina Cave, the deepest known cave on Earth. The Russian team, part of the Perovo SPO caving group from Moscow, included Pavel Demidov, a well-known Russian cave explorer, and the expedition leader. Veryovkina Cave had recently set a world record as the deepest cave, with Demidov and his team reaching a depth of 7,257 feet, 2,212 meters, during a previous expedition in March 2018, surpassing the previous record held by Krubera Cave. Returning in September, the Perovo SPO team aimed to explore new parts of Veryovkina, collect samples of rare species, and use Shawn's photography skills to document the entire cave system, including its remarkable depths. The journey to Veryovkina's lowest point took 4 tough days. They had to descend many ropes, move through waterlogged passages, and deal with narrow, challenging cracks while carrying heavy gear packs. Their base camp, situated 2,200 meters underground, offered a brief rest. There, they spent 3 days exploring new passageways, collecting biological specimens, and taking photographs. In total, the spelunkers spent 7 days underground, a long time in such extreme conditions. Roman Zev and Natalia Sizikov, part of the Russian team, left early to catch their flight home. As they were going up, they reached a camp halfway up the cave, 1,300 meters or 4,200 feet below the surface. There, they encountered a flood pulse. Using the cable wire installed by the Russians for communication, they quickly alerted their companions below. Meanwhile, Robbie Shawn and the rest of the team were just starting breakfast when they got the warning. Flood pulses are not uncommon for cavers, often happening due to heavy rainfall, causing sudden bursts of water through cave entrances. Despite the alarming thunder accompanying the flood pulse, Shawn didn't initially feel too concerned. Their camp was strategically located next to the main vertical shaft, seemingly protected from harm. However, Peter Luboff noticed a gurgling sound coming from a nearby hole next to their tent. Although no water was visible, the flood pulse continued for over 2 hours without stopping. This raised enough concern for him to inform team leader Pavel Demidov. Agreeing with Luboff's assessment, Demidov, along with several others, went to inspect a nearby siphon to check the water table's elevation. Within minutes of Demidov's departure, Lubomov returned to the hole near the tent and saw water rapidly rising. This caused concern to grow. "When Peter turned and looked at me, his face was white," says Shawn. "I just thought, oh my goodness, we have to leave right now. We cannot wait. If we just hang around, we're all going to die." Recognizing the imminent danger, Shawn concluded that immediate evacuation was necessary to ensure their survival. 30 minutes after the warning call from the high camp, the 8 cavers at the deepest point of the cave were startled by the deafening roar of floodwaters. The sound intensified, resembling a freight train thundering through a tunnel, causing the entire cave to tremble as if shaken by an earthquake. It kept growing louder and louder. Robbie recounted, "That sound will stay with me forever." Sensing the imminent danger, Shawn and his companions hastily exited their group tent upon hearing the approaching flood pulse. Clad in fleece undergarments with breakfast bowls still in hand, they directed their headlamps towards the source of the noise. Stunned by the spectacle unfolding before them, Shawn described, "The most enormous torrent of white water appeared out of this hole, and I just stood open-mouthed at the sight of this huge white wall of water entering our little home. The relentless strike of floodwaters continued to surge through the dark abyss, its deafening roar overwhelming. Unprepared for such an event, the cavers found themselves in a frenzy, scrambling to react. As Shawn aptly put it, all hell broke loose. Shawn quickly put on his waterproof latex suit over his warm fleece layer. He made sure to seal it tightly at the neck, wrists, and ankles to keep out water. Wade helped him with the suit, and then Shawn returned the favor. Finally, they both wore sturdy nylon shells to protect against scratches and equipped themselves with safety gear like harnesses, helmets, and ropes for climbing. Sean made a tough decision to leave behind his expensive camera and personal items. Carrying them could slow him down during the difficult climb ahead. Instead, he took only the flashcards from his camera, which held the only photos ever taken of Veryovkina Terminus. He kept them safe in a Ziploc bag inside his latex suit. Suddenly, noticing that Wade was not with him, Sean called out anxiously for his colleague. Wade quickly reassured him that he was coming. In the darkness, Wade informed Peter Lubomov that they were leaving, and received confirmation to proceed while Lubomov waited for Pavel. This was the last interaction between Sean, Wade, and the Russian team at the low camp as they hurriedly began their exit. Sean proceeded towards the ropes that led upward and outward, encountering a precarious traverse over an airy shaft that was now submerged in water. When he reached the end of the traverse, Sean faced the vertical ropes, where he witnessed the furious deluge of floodwater cascading over them. With his ascender secured to the rope, he took a deep breath, bowed his head, and began climbing. The formidable weight of the water relentlessly pounded against him, exerting a crushing, suffocating pressure. Tucking his chin, he sought refuge in a pocket of air beneath his helmet brim as he ascended as swiftly as possible. When he found a spot to briefly escape the torrent, Sean looked ahead and saw a rope leading into a narrow passage of rock completely flooded by the water. "You're kidding me," he said. "I can't fit through that. Where do I go? There's no air, there's nothing." Despite his initial disbelief, Sean understood the importance of moving forward, knowing he was the lead climber. With his companions closely following, he concentrated on the white rope ahead, urging himself to keep moving. Slowly but steadily, he ascended through the narrow shaft, battling against the relentless water. Progress was slow, with Sean pausing frequently to catch his breath amid the onslaught. After overcoming that challenging section, I vividly remember thinking, "I really hope Jeff can handle that because he's got to do that," Robbie recalled. Sean was on the edge of panic, focused solely on climbing as swiftly and high as possible. After navigating through the narrow passage, he found himself in a relatively dry area where the flood had diverted. Wade's voice echoed, urging Robbie to slow down as they were safe now. When they reached an anchor, Sean stopped, waiting for Wade. Jeff looked pale and wide-eyed, simply saying, "Bloody hell, we're alive!" which made them realize they were unsure about the fate of the Russians. Climbing to a camp at 1,900 meters stocked with provisions and medical supplies, they were continually unsettled by the rumble of the flood below. Gazing into the abyss, they spotted a solitary headlamp ascending the ropes. It was team member Andrei Zhikov, who soon joined them at the camp. "Have you seen the others?" Wade queried. Zhikov shook his head no. The trio sat in intense silence, fearing the worst. 15 minutes later, additional headlamps emerged one by one as each of the 5 remaining Russians ascended the rope. "I could not believe it," Sean expressed. "These guys are so strong and so capable." Costa had even carried up a pack with sleeping bags, a stove, and a brew kit, whereas I had almost selfishly only thought about my photos. The Russians narrowly escaped. By the time Pavel Demidov returned from assessing the siphon, the traverse that had been just above water when Sean made his escape was entirely submerged. The Russians had to swim to access the vertical ropes threading through the waterfall. Demidov found himself ensnared in an eddy, swirling as if caught in a colossal vortex. He battled against the current, swimming vigorously to reach the line. In hindsight, I'm so glad it was almost like the weakest one went first, and Pav, the strongest one, came last, Sean reflects. This was at my limit of what I could possibly deal with. The team, now reunited, spent the next 16 hours at the camp. It wasn't long before the Russians entered the tent, brewed some coffee, and began to laugh. Sean, however, remained on edge. He kept his caving gear on, struggled to sleep, and constantly checked the abyss for signs of rising water. Throughout, the flood continued to rumble. Sean harbored concerns about a pseudo-siphon located 70 meters above them. The lengthy horizontal tunnel was typically partially filled with water, and under normal circumstances, traversing it required crawling. With the flood, however, the pseudo-siphon would have been completely submerged. If the water had risen high enough to reach us, it would have been game over, Sean acknowledges. After several hours of restlessness, Sean began to relax somewhat. He joined his comrades in the tent, changed into his fleece, and warmed himself up. Pavle suggested, "Let's just wait until morning," Shan recalls, and he was right. Eventually, it began to subside, which was like music to my ears. Hearing the water diminish in force and volume was the most incredible sound. The flood lasted almost 20 hours, caused by heavy rain over a week. A single storm dropped large raindrops for a whole day. The soil got completely soaked, leading to a rupture below ground and a big rush of water. The Russians used to think Veryovkina only flooded in winter, but now they know that's not true. Despite being scary, it taught them a lot. They're now working on better monitoring and using special radios for communication. They're also planning to set up a new camp in the lowest part to have another way out if there's flooding again. Even though the flood cut the expedition short by a day, it was still considered a success. They discovered and explored new passages, collected many cave creatures for study, and conducted various climbs to check for upper-level passages. Yet, the potential of the world's deepest cave is still largely unknown to this team of explorers. This marks the peak of human achievement in caving, Sean declares. Initially planning extensive photography, he had to abandon this due to his narrow escape and equipment loss. After the flood, Demidov salvaged Sean's ruined camera and other items. One of Sean's light cases got lodged high, potentially marking the extent of floodwaters. Sean emphasizes the importance of skill and resilience in a caving team. Conserving energy is crucial, he stresses. This team showed the strength and mindset needed in dire circumstances. They excel in exploring the world's deepest cave, Sean reflects. They belong to a league of the world's most exceptional explorers. The escape from Veryovkina Cave was a grueling test of human endurance. Exhausted, battered, and facing the constant threat of drowning, the team clung to hope. One by one, they crossed a precarious rope bridge over a churning torrent, the raw power of the water a terrifying reminder of their situation. Every inch forward on the narrow ledge above the abyss was a battle against despair. The Veryovkina Cave incident serves as a stark reminder of the immense power and unforgiving nature of the hidden world beneath our feet. It's a story of human courage, resilience, and the will to survive against all odds. Imagine you're a highly trained diver, ready to conquer the depths of the ocean. You've got the gear, the skills, and the nerves of steel. But what if, on a seemingly routine dive, everything went horribly wrong? This is the chilling true story of the Waga Drill 2, an oil rig in the North Sea where a mission that promised adventure turned into a fight for survival. Join us as we plunge into the depths of this tragedy. We'll meet Peter and Roger, two experienced divers tasked with a simple job. We'll explore the world of saturation diving, a marvel of technology that allows humans to live and work underwater for days. But a twist of fate, a single mistake, throws everything into chaos. The unforgiving sea turns from a workplace into a death trap. We'll uncover the terrifying truth behind what happened, the frantic fight to save lives, and the devastating consequences that unfolded. This disaster wasn't a raging storm or a monstrous wave. It was a silent killer hiding in the shadows, a reminder that even the most prepared can fall victim to the ocean's unforgiving grip. So, get ready for the true story of the Waga Drill 2. It's a tale of bravery, of human error, and the enduring fight for survival in the face of unimaginable danger. Let's dive deep and learn the lessons hidden in the murky depths of this underwater tragedy. Saturation diving is a method where divers stay underwater for long periods. This helps their bodies adjust to the gas they breathe. Instead of coming up and down multiple times, they only decompress once at the end. This reduces the risk of getting sick from changes in pressure. When divers breathe pressurized gas, their bodies absorb inert gas. If they come up too quickly, this gas can cause problems like decompression sickness. But with saturation diving, the gas reaches a saturation point where it doesn't increase anymore. So divers can stay down longer without adding more gas. To do this safely, divers live in pressurized environments underwater or on the surface until their job is done. They use a special gas mix, usually helium and oxygen, to breathe. This keeps them safe and helps them work better. Saturation diving keeps divers in a saturated state, where their bodies are adjusted to the pressure. They live in sealed environments when not diving, either underwater or on the surface. This can last for weeks. Divers only decompress once at the end of their duty. This reduces the risk of decompression sickness and saves time. They breathe a mix of helium and oxygen to stay safe and work better. Saturation diving is a specialized type of diving, with only a small percentage of divers practicing it. It requires special training and certification due to its risks. Saturation divers use specific procedures and equipment to control these risks. Although it's expensive and requires a lot of personnel and equipment, it allows diving in places where other methods aren't feasible. Overall, it's often the most cost-effective option for certain underwater tasks. On September 9, 1975, two divers, Peter Holmes, 29, and Roger Baldwin, 24, were brought up from the North Sea in a diving bell and connected to the system's entrance lock. They had just finished a dive to clear a tangle of rope at a depth of 390 feet around the guideposts of the blowout preventer. The dive went smoothly, and the plan was to decompress the men inside the bell to a depth of 310 feet. Then they would be moved into the chamber complex and kept there to undergo saturation. In deep-sea diving systems, each chamber had valves and gauges on the supervisor's control panel. Redundancy was important, so valves could be adjusted to make any depth gauge monitor a different chamber. Chamber 1 had a 1,000-foot Heise gauge, known for its accuracy. The shift supervisor would set this gauge to track the bell's depth before divers ascended, ensuring a smooth transition. This prevented decompression issues that could arise from using two gauges with differing readings. Once the divers safely moved from the bell to Chamber 1, the supervisor would return the valves to their original positions to monitor the diver's depth accurately. That night at 9:50 p.m., the crew connected the bell to the entrance lock as planned. However, while they were doing this, there was a gas leak between the parts they were connecting. They had to take the bell off, clean the surfaces, and try again. The second time, they managed to seal the bell to the system properly. After making sure the pressure inside the bell matched the rest of the complex, Holmes and Baldwin opened the door inside the bell and started moving into the entrance lock. But suddenly, the gas leak came back. The gauge showed that the pressure was dropping, so they tried to seal off the entrance lock door to stop the gas from getting in. However, they couldn't do it successfully, as noted in the dive log. To keep Holmes and Baldwin safe from losing more pressure, the supervisor told them to move into Chamber 1. Once inside, they leaned against the hatch while the supervisor put a bit of helium into the chamber to seal the door. However, the supervisor forgot to adjust the valves to reconnect the Heise gauge with Chamber 1. Since Chamber 1 didn't have its own depth gauge, Holmes and Baldwin were now in a part of the system where no gauge was monitoring them. Meanwhile, the Heise gauge still showed a drop in pressure, but the supervisor mistakenly thought it was reading Chamber 1. He believed he hadn't sealed the hatch properly, so he started pumping a lot of helium into the chamber where the two divers were. When the supervisor finally realized his mistake, it was too late. Holmes and Baldwin had been subjected to rapid pressurization, going from 310 feet to 650 feet in just a few minutes. This quick change in pressure, along with helium's ability to transfer heat rapidly and the high humidity, caused the temperature inside the chamber to spike from around 90 degrees Fahrenheit to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The two divers tried desperately to open the chamber hatch to escape, but they couldn't manage it. They even removed the mattresses from their bunks and lay on the cooler aluminum surfaces, but the air was too hot and unbearable. Sadly, the two divers, Peter Holmes and Roger Baldwin, died due to hyperthermia several hours later. The judge in charge of the inquiry into the accident pointed out that the diving system, especially when operated by oceaneering, had a high risk of human error, especially during emergencies. Oceaneering's safety officer testified that the way the control panel was set up was partly to blame for the accident. He said that if the panel for Chamber 1 had its own depth gauge that only showed the depth of that chamber, the accident probably wouldn't have happened. With a dedicated gauge, the supervisor wouldn't have been confused by the Heise gauge readings, so there wouldn't have been a reason to pump so much helium into the chamber, and this tragic incident never happened. Time seemed to crawl agonizingly slow as the crew on the Waggadrill 2 rushed to fix their error. They worked frantically to lower the pressure in the chamber, hoping to restore the vital air that Peter and Roger required. However, it was too late. The damage had been done. Hyperthermia had already taken its toll, claiming its victims. When the chamber was finally opened, a wave of grief washed over the rig. Peter and Roger, two skilled divers with a bright future ahead, were gone. Their lifeless bodies were a stark reminder of the ocean's unforgiving nature and the razor-thin line between glory and tragedy in the world of deep-sea exploration. The Waggadrill 2 accident became a turning point for commercial diving. New safety protocols were established, training was modernized, and procedures were tightened. But the cost was heavy. 2 lives lost in the pursuit of progress beneath the waves. Within, 5 men gathered, their words muted by the heavy helmets they wore. They were LMCS divers, renowned for their expertise, prepared for yet another dive at berth number 6. A vital artery of Trinidad's industrial network, where an oil pipeline coursed through the depths. The current pulled them relentlessly into the oil-coated 30-inch underwater pipeline at astonishing speed. In this harrowing moment, these 5 men were thrust into an unimaginable waking nightmare. Only one would survive to recount the tale. A GoPro camera mounted on one of the divers captured the precise moment disaster struck. A primal fear gripped them.
Yeah! I'm 35 too!
This wasn't part of the plan. This was a nightmare come true. Trapped in a metal tomb, hurtling through an unknown darkness, they fought for a single, desperate breath. On February 25, 2022, at Berth 6 platform in Pointe-de-Pierre, the LMCS team consisting of Faisal Kurban, Kazim Ali Jr., Rishi Nagasar, Yusuf Henry, and Christopher Boudrum were assigned maintenance duties on a dormant pipeline. This pipeline belonged to Pariah Fuel Company, a government-owned oil company in Trinidad and Tobago. The pipeline in question was a 30-inch U-shaped pipeline that traversed the seabed, designed to ferry oil from Berth 6, where ships unloaded their cargo, to Berth 5, the refinery. Although some risk was inherent, the 5-person diving team was well prepared and experienced. They utilized an air tube inside a diving belt, along with a unique habitat shaped like an 8-foot cube, providing a dry workspace for the LMCS maintenance team. LMCS installed the cube structure over the pipe at Berth 6 to displace the water inside the work area. The cube created a pocket of air pressure that pushed out the ocean water, creating a suitable workspace. Once prepared, this work area enabled the crew to remove their diving gear and safely utilize their tools to carry out their essential tasks. Undoubtedly, they had executed this procedure hundreds of times before. As the 5 veteran divers went about their duties, it seemed like business as usual until it wasn't. 2 weeks prior, the company had installed an inflatable plug to safeguard the pipeline's oil and prevent contamination. Although the line wasn't operational at the time, it could be activated when required. In the industry, this situation is known as dead legs, and it comes with its share of risks. While this procedure is standard, it necessitates meticulous planning, hazard risk assessment, and vigilant monitoring. Preparing for maintenance tasks like this can take days, if not longer. Unfortunately, it appears the oil company may have been unwilling to adequately prepare for a safe operation. Nevertheless, like most employees, the 5 divers were simply following orders. Descending to their work site, they were unaware of the impending danger. As it turns out, inflatable plugs like the one installed are pressurized, holding back high-pressure air in the diving bell and low-pressure air in the pipe itself. These circumstances set the stage for disaster. Once Ali Jr. handed a wrench to his crewmates in the diving bell, they began loosening the valve to release the plug. The 5 divers had no warning. As soon as they released the plug, the pressure difference transformed the inside of the pipe into a relentless vortex, ruthlessly sucking in air, water, people, and equipment into its depths. The suction's power was overwhelming, and a torrent of water flooded into the diving bell, turning their sanctuary into a death trap. The sudden influx of water and pressure differential unleashed a force that dragged them and their tools into the narrow pipeline. In the blink of an eye, they found themselves hurtling violently through a whirlpool of water and oil for an agonizing 90 seconds, fighting for oxygen. Suddenly, they came to a stop. They gathered themselves and assessed their positions in the pipe, realizing the gravity of their situation. They discovered that the violent tornado of water, air, and oil had left them settled somewhere in the line where an air pocket allowed them to breathe. The sole survivor, Christopher Boudrum, vividly recounts how it all unfolded. The only thing I remember being able to do was cover my head in a protective position. After that, all I recall is being pulled into the pipe at unbelievable speeds. I couldn't hold my breath any longer, and I was underwater for too long. Eventually, your body gives in, no matter how hard you fight. It was an unbelievable nightmare. My eyes burned every time I tried to open them in the pitch-black darkness. I couldn't see anything. My throat burned, my ears rang, and my body ached. At that point, I thought I was going to die. Their struggle for survival had only just begun. The men found themselves trapped inside a 1,200-foot-long oil pipe, disoriented, injured, and consumed by absolute terror. Amidst the chaos and fear, they tried to communicate and uplift each other's spirits. However, the grim reality of their situation crushed any semblance of hope for survival. The GoPro camera, which had been with them on the dive, recorded every second of their ordeal, capturing the sheer terror and sounds of their struggle as they fought for their lives. Initially, Chris believed they had been propelled through the pipe head first, so they attempted to crawl backward to escape. However, Kazim, Yusuf, and Faiso were convinced they had entered feet first. With the majority's judgment, Chris trusted their assessment. As the least injured diver, Chris positioned his feet on Kazim's shoulders. He instructed Kazim to pull the rest of the group together and directed Faisal, who was at the back, to push everyone forward. Linked together like a chain, with Chris at the front, they began their attempt to escape from the pipe. Squeezing their way through thick, slippery oil residue and pitch-black darkness was unbearable. Dealing with broken bones, burning eyes, a sore throat, and extreme discomfort weighed them down. Their progress was excruciatingly slow, and the end seemed nowhere in sight. Despite the challenges, the men kept praying and moving to the best of their abilities. Eventually, they stumbled upon 2 oxygen tanks with the regulators still attached. Chris informed the men that breathing the air inside the pipe could make them delirious and nauseous. He advised them to take small sips from the tank at intervals to ensure clear oxygen in their system. However, as they progressed, they encountered rising water levels, complicating their already dire situation. Christopher noticed that some group members struggled to breathe and suffered various injuries, while others were blocked and unable to move. As he moved forward, Chris found that the next segment of the pipe was entirely underwater. With just 2 oxygen tanks for 5 individuals, it wasn't safe to proceed any further. Knowing this, Chris faced the hardest decision of his life. He had to continue alone to seek help for everyone. After explaining the situation to the others, they agreed it was their only chance and gave Chris one of the oxygen tanks. Chris promised that he would get help and come back for them. With a heavy heart, he left, prepared to brave the unknown in order to save his comrades. Still unsure of his direction and how much air remained in his tank, Chris swam through the submerged section with the tank leading the way, hoping to find more air soon. The pipe had flooded sections, some with pockets of air. After struggling underwater, he realized his oxygen was running out. With his diving instincts kicking in, he took his last breath from the tank. By chance, his tank collided with another metal object, a second oxygen tank. He frantically searched for the regulator in the darkness, finally found it in the pitch black. However, it had no mouthpiece, so he pushed the whole thing into his mouth, covered in oily sludge, and managed to breathe a sigh of relief. Determined to continue, Chris pressed on, unsure how long he could last. Clambering through the pipe, he reached another air pocket, but he knew his only escape was to return to the riser. Unfortunately, this part of the pipe was half full of water. He found another air tank and reached the last flooded section before the riser. He heard Faisal calling his name. Faisal had been following Chris. Faisal asked Chris to wait before entering the last flooded section, but Chris told him he couldn't wait any longer. They had been in the pipe too long, and time was running out. Chris continued until he found the bend in the pipe that he hoped would lead to salvation. After what seemed like hours, the next decision would determine his fate. This was the moment of truth. Either this was berth 5, sealed off by a plug, or it was berth 6, where they had started. Making up his mind for the 3rd time, with one last push of determination, he kicked off towards the riser. As Chris continued to swim, he realized how tired he was, but he was determined to make it out and save his crew. Chris eventually made it to the top of the pipe. Though he survived the ordeal, it wasn't over yet. As Chris described the situation to the medical staff, he shared as many details as possible about the men and their position. Unfortunately, the rest of the LMCS team couldn't believe Chris's story. The company assumed that the pipeline was filled with oil and that any oxygen tanks they had would only provide an hour of air each. Rescue divers from the LMCS team dove down and knocked on the pipe, trying to locate the trapped men. They received the reassuring sounds of someone knocking back, undoubtedly giving the trapped men hope. However, the LMCS team had yet to find a way to get them out. As the hours passed, the 4 injured divers endured their injuries, survived with dwindling air, suffocating oil fumes, rising seawater, and carbon dioxide. Though it seemed like Pariah Trading Company and LMCS would save the 4 men at first, a rescue never happened. The company retrieved the 4 remaining bodies days later. They did autopsies, but no one could agree on when each man died. Officials thought they survived until Saturday, but some guessed one lasted until Monday. Officials started an investigation in Trinidad and Tobago to find out what caused the Pariah diving tragedy. Kazim, Yusuf, Kurban, and Nagasar wouldn't be coming home. Their families were left shattered. Children lost their fathers, wives their husbands, parents their sons. The laughter, the stories, the dreams they shared, all abruptly silenced. The pain was raw, a gaping wound that refused to heal. Crabtree Falls is a series of waterfalls located in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. At 1,200 feet total, it is one of the tallest sets of waterfalls in the United States. This, coupled with the fact that it is located along the famous Blue Ridge Parkway, makes Crabtree Falls a popular spot for hikers and travelers from far and wide. Most of the time, an afternoon visit to these scenic waterfalls is a good time, just as you would naturally expect. But many visitors don't realize how often Crabtree Falls turns from tranquil to traumatizing. The number of deaths that have occurred at this one spot is quite surprising. According to the United States Forest Service, at least 30 people have lost their lives at Crabtree Falls in recent decades. What's more, as you'll soon see, virtually all of them seem to befall a very similar fate, much to the continued dismay of local officials. There are multiple reasons why these idyllic waterfalls are deceptively dangerous. In order to reach them, you have to take a relatively short but demanding hike on the Crabtree Falls Trail. Officials from the United States Forest Service are adamant that under no circumstances should you deviate from the trail, despite the appeal of getting closer to the falls. The first reason is that these falls are simply massive. Crabtree Falls consists of 5 cascades, and the tallest of these cascades is a vertigo-inducing 400 feet high. This makes it the tallest American waterfall anywhere east of the Mississippi River. Other falls in the series are similarly tall. As I said earlier, the total combined height of the 5 cascades is a whopping 1,200 feet, according to the U.S. Forest Service. So, simply put, this is a very steep landscape. Another less obvious reason is moss. The rocks that cover the slopes around the waterfalls are unusually slippery. Most of them are covered in plant growth, which, unsurprisingly, is always wet. Multiple signs posted throughout the area have been put up to warn visitors about these dangerously slippery rocks, and officials have even put fences and walls up along the trail to physically block people from putting themselves in danger. Sadly, even this has not always been enough. The record books continue to fill with tragic tales of visitors who mistakenly thought they could venture safely outside the bounds of the Crabtree Falls Trail. What follows is an account of some of the recent tragedies that have befallen this small, scenic corner of the world. So sit back, relax, and prepare to be shocked, because I guarantee this waterfall set is deadlier than you think. On Saturday, March 22nd in the year 2008, Robert Slimak was on a hiking trip with some friends near Crabtree Falls. Slimak was studying law at the University of Richmond at the time, which is about 2 hours east of Crabtree Falls, and he was due to graduate in just a few months. His fellow hikers were all fraternity friends from a previous university they had studied at together. The 26-year-old Slimak was familiar with the area, having visited several times before. However, this time, things would be different. At around 3:30 p.m., after stepping over a 1-foot-high stone wall that lines the edge of the hiking trail, Slimak suddenly lost his footing and slipped. This spelled disaster. To the horror of his friends, he tumbled down the steep, watery landscape. Slimak's chances of survival were almost non-existent on such extreme terrain, and sadly, he died on the spot. There was nothing rescue workers, his friends, or terrified onlookers could do. A little over 2 years after Robert Slimak's tragic death, on November 22, 2010, 21-year-old Elijah Lehman and a group of friends were hiking the Crabtree Falls Trail. Like Slimak, Lehman was also a student. At the time, he was a senior at Virginia Tech studying industrial design. Like most who visit Crabtree Falls, Lehman was enthralled by the beauty of the waterfalls, so he started taking pictures. Eventually, Lehman decided he'd like to try and get closer to the falls to see if he could get an even better shot of them. He made the fateful decision to step over the boundary and begin climbing on the unmaintained cliffs surrounding the falls, not realizing the seriousness of the danger he was putting himself in. Not long afterwards, a nearby resident named Jesse Quick noticed what he later described as piles of cops and rescue units outside his home. Knowing the area well, and knowing that he lived close to the notorious Crabtree Falls, Quick, a 17-year resident of Nelson County, immediately had a sinking feeling that he knew exactly what was going on. Sadly, he was right. The Montebello Rescue Squad had bolted to the scene to try and save Elias Lehman's life. He had slipped and fallen down the waterfall, but amazingly, he was still just barely alive. Working as fast as they possibly could, Both the rescue squad and 4 of Lehman's friends rushed the ailing Lehman back down the trail in the hopes of getting him to the nearest hospital. But tragically, Lehman finally succumbed to his injuries and passed away as he was being carried. At Virginia Tech, Lehman had been an honors student. He is described by friends and family as having had a great sense of humor and a dedication to improving the world. Adding to the heartbreak is the fact that Elias Lehman would not be the last life cut tragically short by Crabtree Falls. A few years later, on April 8, 2013, an 18-year-old student from Liberty University named Faith Helbig was hiking the Crabtree Falls Trail with 5 other friends who were fellow students. That Monday in early April was one of the first days of the year that Central Virginia was getting warmer weather, as winter began to give way to spring. This meant that Helbig and her friends would have been far from the only ones at the already popular hiking spot that day. Like so many visitors who find themselves in awe of these incredible waterfalls, Helbig and her friends began taking pictures as they climbed the trail. The spectacle of the falls seemed to grow greater and greater the higher they climbed. Eventually, the group reached the top of one of the area's tallest falls, with a drop of around 200 feet straight down. It was at this point that a friend of Helbig's snapped one of the more haunting photos you'll ever see in your lifetime. The photo was soon to be published by news outlets around the country, such as ABC News. It features Helbig standing with her arm around a friend, and both are leaning against the railing at the top of the waterfall. It's a beautiful photo, and one that could easily commemorate happy memories, if not for what was to happen just minutes after it was taken. At this point, it was just before 6 p.m. After hiking around 2 miles, Helbig and her friends decided they wanted more photos from other angles. This meant daring to venture into restricted areas that were blocked off by numerous warning signs. It is reported that it wasn't just Helbig who went into the restricted area, her friends went with her. However, it was Helbig who, all of a sudden, stepped on one rock that was just a bit too slippery. Right before her friend's eyes, Helbig fell 200 feet below. According to a friend who dialed 911, Helbig slid all the way down, bumping into things and hitting her back and eventually her head. The friend, who had run over a mile to make the 911 call, said desperately over the phone that they needed an ambulance or a helicopter as soon as humanly possible. But even if rescue workers had literally been standing at the bottom of the waterfall when she slipped, the impact from the fall would likely have surpassed any efforts they could have made. About 4 hours later, Wintergreen Fire and Rescue pulled Faith Helbig's lifeless body off of a boulder at the bottom of the waterfall. Helbig was just 1 semester into her studies at Liberty University, but by all accounts, she had a big personality and had already bonded with many of her fellow students. Her death sent shock waves across campus. It also compelled the senior vice president for student affairs, Mark Hine, to reiterate the warnings of local officials about the dangers of hiking at Crabtree Falls. Indeed, one starts to wonder what can be done when the same story seems to keep repeating itself. Visitors, who are often college students, visit Crabtree Falls, make the mistake of ignoring the posted signs, climb out into a restricted area, then slip, fall, and inevitably lose their lives. Surely, looking at the massive heights of the falls here, one would assume there is virtually no chance of survival once you slip. But incredibly, the next major accident that would take place at Crabtree Falls would defy the expectations of even the most seasoned rescue workers in Central Virginia. Jeffrey Snook of Verona, Virginia has a unique claim to fame. He might just be the only person in history to fall down a waterfall at Crabtree Falls and survive. This required an improbable sequence of events that may never be repeated again. The date was June 20th, 2014, the start of summer just 1 year after Faith Helbig's tragic death. Snook was there with some friends hiking and enjoying the summer weather. It wasn't his first time either. A local, Snook had hiked the Crabtree Falls Trail on several occasions prior. He was familiar with the area, and presumably he was also aware of the dangers and recent deaths that had occurred at the falls. But even though he had seen the falls multiple times before, Jeffrey still found himself enthralled by their stunning beauty. He says he wanted to get a better view and didn't notice that he was wandering past markers telling him he should turn back. As he approached a large rock on the falls, Jeffrey Snook slipped. He fell a cataclysmic 75 feet, roughly the equivalent of leaping off the top of the White House, and landed in a small, rocky pool of water. The impact wreaked havoc on Snook's body. His pelvis was shattered. Both his right leg and his right arm were badly broken. He also shattered his hip, which is the largest bone in the human body and is widely agreed to be the most painful bone to break, let alone shatter. But what is absolutely miraculous about Jeffrey's fall is that, despite all this horrible damage caused by crashing into numerous rocks, he never hit his head. The crushing landing was enough to knock him completely unconscious. But hours later, Jeffrey Snook opened his eyes again. He had survived an hour-and-a-half transport to the hospital, and, after being brought back to life 3 times at the University of Virginia Medical Center, he had woken up. He had survived something for which his chances of dying had to have been astronomical, but Jeffrey now had a very tough road ahead of him. He would not leave the hospital again for another 2 months, and he was initially unable to walk. He underwent a litany of surgeries, including multiple on his hip, and had no less than 150 staples put into his body. In those early weeks, many, including Jeffrey, were fearful that he would never be able to walk again. It would take a strenuous rehabilitation process to learn how to walk again. But with the occasional assistance of a cane, today, Jeffrey Snook is able to walk. As grateful as he is to not only have survived but retained his mobility, there is one place Jeffrey has yet to return: Crabtree Falls. However, about 1 year after his fall, the recovering Jeffrey Snook would hear news of another hiker who had taken a similar tumble and wasn't so lucky. Franklin Miguel Madrona Guevara was originally from El Salvador, but he was living in Annandale, Virginia on a visa. In June of 2015, Guevara was 20 years old. On June 9th, he visited Crabtree Falls as part of a church group he belonged to, which was also from Annandale. The dark, familiar story then began to play out to the same tune as it had so many times before. Amazed or perhaps even hypnotized by the allure of the falls, Guevara became determined to take the best picture he could. Sometime during the afternoon, Guevara and the group were around mile marker 1.5 when Guevara decided to stray from the path. His brother, who was also a member of the church group, later told the county sheriff that Guevara was trying to get a better picture of the falls. Like Jeffrey Snook a year earlier, Guevara suddenly lost his footing and fell 75 feet below. The horrified members of his church group scrambled down the hillside to where Guevara's motionless body now lay. They found Guevara lying unconscious in a pool of water. Amazingly, he still had a pulse, but it was growing more and more faint by the minute. The church group was now in a serious dilemma because no one in the group could speak English very well. Searching for help, some of the group members were able to attract the attention of another group of hikers. Realizing what had happened, this group immediately decided to call 911, but found there was no cell reception in the area. Only after relocating were they able to actually place the call to the authorities. The local sheriff's office reports receiving the call at 5:20 p.m. But in the commotion leading up to it, it isn't not known for sure exactly how much time had passed from when Guevara initially fell down the waterfall. The Piney River Fire Department, Montebello Fire and Emergency Medical Services, and the same special ropes team that had extracted the body of Faith Helbig 2 years earlier all arrived on the scene, but by then it was too late. Guevara's pulse stopped before he could be put into a helicopter that had just landed close by. Guevara's death made news headlines around the country and significantly raised awareness about the severe dangers of hiking in restricted areas at Crabtree Falls. More than ever, the general public began to wonder what exactly was going on and why so many people were gambling with their safety and losing at this one infamous spot. Whatever concerns were spreading following the death of Franklin Miguel Madrona Guevara, they would pale in comparison to what would come just a couple months later. Less than 3 months after the tragic death of Franklin Miguel Madrona Guevara, 31-year-old Daniel Wayne Kistner and his brother were visiting Crabtree Falls from their hometown of Chesapeake, Virginia. Once again, the pair were snapping lots of pictures, and at this point it's worth mentioning that there is nothing inherently wrong with taking pictures. Crabtree Falls is a beautiful place, and the vast majority of visitors who photograph this natural wonder do so without any problem whatsoever. What is problematic, and is at this point the bane of the park officials' existence, is when visitors climb into restricted areas that are unsafe in order to take those pictures. And that, unfortunately, is exactly what Daniel Wayne Kistner did. This seems particularly surprising given how recently another young man had fallen to his death doing exactly the same thing in the same place. However, despite the increasing concerns over the safety of the area, it's still quite possible neither Kistner or his brother knew about Franklin Miguel Madrona Guevara. In fact, reporters who had interviewed visitors to the waterfall the very next day after Guevara's death said that many hadn't heard the news themselves. But whether he knew about the deadly history of the location or not, Kistner repeated the actions of those before him and eventually climbed into dangerous, slippery areas to try and get better photos of the falls. And then, all of a sudden, he stepped onto a spot that was just a little too slippery and a little too dangerous, and he slipped. That Saturday, August 22, 2015, Daniel Wayne Kistner became the next life claimed by Crabtree Falls. And it happened while Guevara's family was still grieving and Jeffrey Snook was still recovering from his injuries. This seemed to pose a terrifying question. Why were deaths at Crabtree Falls getting more and more common, and would the trend continue? Following the death of Daniel Wayne Kistner, the chief of Wintergreen Fire and Rescue, Curtis Sheets, proposed a compelling theory. He thinks smartphones might be to blame. So many Crabtree Falls victims slip and fall when taking pictures, and now that almost everyone has a high-quality camera in their pocket at all times, the number of visitors taking pictures has skyrocketed. However, despite the plausibility of this theory, there was an unexplained dip in incidents in the years following. Officials and area residents alike began to exercise a cautious optimism, hoping that perhaps word was finally spreading about how dangerous it is to deviate from the Crabtree Falls Trail. But that all changed on May 22, 2022. Leonard Zimmerman was just 8 years old when University of Richmond student Robert Slimak fell to his death at Crabtree Falls. But in May of 2022, he was 22, and now he was hiking the Crabtree Falls Trail. Zimmerman was from Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, roughly 200 miles away, so there is a higher than usual chance he wasn't familiar with the area. Based on the news reports, it also sounds like Zimmerman was traveling alone, because it was a witness who called 911 to report seeing a body tumble down the falls. It was the body of 22-year-old Leonard Zimmerman. Rescue teams rushed to the scene, as they have had to do so many times before, but it was too late. Zimmerman's life had been cut swiftly and heart-wrenchingly short. At the time this video was produced, Leonard Zimmerman is the last person to have died as a result of falling at Crabtree Falls. He is either the 30th or the 31st person to do so. It is truly shocking that one scenic location in Virginia could be so lethal. Local officials have estimated that about 2 or 3 people die every year at Crabtree Falls. If that's true, it means visiting Crabtree Falls is statistically more dangerous than quite a few things most of us are afraid to do. And wandering off the trail to get a better shot is simply off the charts. The authorities in the area seem to feel like they're doing everything they can do short of closing the area altogether. Wintergreen Fire and Rescue Chief Curtis Sheets says the Crabtree Falls Trail is the best marked trail he's ever seen. On the U.S. Forest Service website, there is a glaring message about the extraordinarily slippery conditions and the numerous fatalities they have caused. Yet somehow, these warnings are not always enough. We hope this video can help to spread awareness about the tragedies that have occurred at this location, and how truly dangerous it is to disobey those posted signs. Crabtree Falls is a beautiful place, and it can be appreciated and well photographed without having to leave the trail.
On November 27, 2022, Mauna Loa, the world's largest active volcano, began erupting for the first time in almost 40 years. Fortunately for residents of the island of Hawaii, the area was much more prepared for an eruption than ever before in terms of both infrastructure and data. But the reason the island is now so heavily prepared for eruptions like this is because decades ago, it wasn't. Unlike its smaller neighbor, Kilauea, which has been continuously erupting for decades, the monster-sized Mauna Loa does not erupt very often, according to the history books. But when it does, the results can be nothing short of apocalyptic. Just ask the people who lived on the Big Island in the year 1926. That year, Mauna Loa erupted dramatically and subjected locals to one of the most terrifying natural disasters you can imagine. On April 10, 1926, the island of Hawaii was still part of the territory of Hawaii, which was not yet a U.S. state. Residents, most of whom worked in fields growing sugarcane or pineapples, were suddenly startled by the rattle of an earthquake. The earthquake was nowhere near big enough to signal an emergency, but it was definitely big enough to be widely felt, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. To make things more unsettling, the first earthquake was soon followed by another, and then another. Many of the people who had been living on the island for some time would have been aware that most of the island's surface is actually comprised of volcanoes. In fact, the island of Hawaii is formed out of 5 distinct but connected shield volcanoes. Mauna Loa, the biggest not only on the island but in the world, covers roughly half of the entire island. Even more impressive when you consider the island of Hawaii is bigger than all the other Hawaiian islands put together. So in other words, half the time you're standing anywhere on the island of Hawaii, you're standing somewhere on the extremely long slopes of Mauna Loa. And if you were standing there on April 10th, 1926, feeling a rapid series of earthquakes beneath your feet, you may have realized that what you were feeling were really the slopes of the world's largest volcano rumbling. At the time, there were only a few seismographs set up around the island to monitor volcanic activity. Seismographs, in their modern form, were still a relatively new technology back then, and they of course lacked many of the modern electronic and recording components they now have today. Still, around half an hour before the series of earthquakes began, these seismographs picked up some unusual activity. The data, which back then would have been printed onto paper by a mechanical stylus, indicated that a volcanic tremor had taken place beneath the island's surface. Beneath the island's surface lies the Hawaii Hotspot, a huge underground plume of magma that's responsible for the formation of the Hawaiian Islands in the first place. The islands themselves are literally a trail of volcanic eruptions, according to National Geographic. A volcanic tremor is, in essence, an indication that an island might be about to change its shape and size. And the way volcanic islands change their shape and size is by spewing out molten lava that pours all over the place and eventually hardens. That's pretty bad news if you happen to live there. And on April 10th, as those who felt the earthquakes may have already been fearing, the bad news arrived. Starting at the summit, which is a dizzying 13,678 feet above the world-famous beaches below, lava began erupting out of Mauna Loa. A glowing orange syrup as hot as 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit billowed out into the air like it was boiling on a stove. Soon, the eruption migrated down Mauna Loa's southwest rift zone, which overlooked the village of Huapuloa. Days went by. Lava continued to burst out of the volcano, slowly spilling over and spreading ominously further and further downhill. 3 days into the eruption, the island was hit with more earthquakes. And this time, some of them were more violent. This meant that up on top of Mauna Loa, things were about to get worse. And for the people of Huapuloa, a lot worse. On April 14th, 4 days after the eruption began, a fissure several miles long opened up downhill at around 8,000 feet elevation. This main flow of lava marched unstoppably down the slopes of the volcano until, to the horror of fleeing locals, it began eating its way into Huapuloa. In 1926, the small town of Huapuloa consisted of 12 houses, 1 church, and 1 harbor. In the ensuing days, the lava flow from Mauna Loa consumed 12 houses, 1 church, and 1 harbor. There's a reason why you can't find Huapuloa on a map today. It no longer exists. As destructive as this was, given how massive the lava flow was, the island was lucky the damage wasn't much worse. This was not some ankle-splashing little stream. As absolutely shocking old photos of the event illustrate, the lava flow was between 25 to 28 feet tall and 1,500 feet wide. Let me repeat that. 25 to 28 feet tall and 1,500 feet wide, and able to melt virtually everything it touches. According to the United States Geological Survey, eruptions that take place in Mauna Loa's southwest rift zone, like the 1926 eruption, are especially dangerous because of how steep the slopes are. It took 4 days for the lava to reach all the way down to the ocean. If a similar eruption took place today, and the island was as unprepared as it was back then, the destruction would be phenomenal. Today, the west coast of the Big Island is home to the island's most famous area, Kona, which has about 22,000 residents. Don't forget that it's also part of an island that now sees somewhere around 150,000 visitors every month. Who knows what destruction a near 30-foot avalanche that can melt cars and trees would do in the 21st century. Luckily, scientists are much more equipped with tools to monitor the volcano's activity. However, diverting lava flows once they start remains a tricky task even today. Many tactics have been tried, including, and I'm not making this up, bombing the volcano. This was attempted by General George S. Patton in the mid-20th century after another Hawaii eruption. The lava flows did seem to die down somewhat shortly after the bombing campaign, but most scientists seem to agree today that this was just a coincidence. The reality is that volcanoes, particularly ones as powerful as Mauna Loa, are forces of nature we have little ability to control. The eruption of 1926 eventually died down by April 26th, more than 2 weeks after it had started. When all was said and done, roughly 13.4 square miles of new land had been, let's say, introduced to Ho'opuloa and the surrounding island. That land is of course still part of the island of Hawaii today. New lava flows have since occurred, further changing the shape of the island, and no doubt many more will occur in the future. This is indeed how the island came to exist in the first place. National Geographic has described this as Hawaii's dark secret. It's a remote destination, famous for honeymoons and romantic getaways, lined with sunlit beaches and the epitome of laid-back vibes. But the islands are built out of the smoldering ash of enormous volcanoes, resting not in a random spot in the ocean, but in a very specific and violent location on the Pacific Plate. Sipping a pina colada with your feet in the sand, it's pretty easy to forget the hellish forces of nature that are lurking underneath you. But every once in a while, the islands remind us all with a rude awakening.
When it comes to climbing dangerous mountains, accidents are inevitable. 3 deaths and 12 injured people sound like the number of accidents you might expect to see on a mountain during a given year, but never during the course of a single day. Such a day would be so statistically improbable as to go down in history as one of the darkest days in mountaineering history. Yet such a day did occur. On August 13th, 2022, 3 people died and a dozen were injured on 3 different volcanoes in the South American nation of Ecuador. The Ecuadorian Association of Mountain Guides indeed went on to describe it as, quote, a black day for mountaineering. This is the unbelievable story of what happened that day. Ecuador's location in the northwest of South America makes it one of the most environmentally diverse countries in the world, along with other neighboring countries such as Colombia. From the Andes Mountains to Amazon rainforests to beautiful beaches and even the Galapagos Islands, Ecuador is teeming with life and mesmerizing landscapes. One thing that Ecuador features that it is less widely known for is volcanoes. Ecuador has 68 of them. Many of these volcanoes are popular with the mountaineering community, including 3 in particular which are relevant to our story today. They are Keri Huayrazo, Iliniza Sur, and Cayambe. All 3 are located in the Ecuadorian Andes, and all are between 16,000 and 19,000 feet high. The tallest is Cayambe, standing at an impressive 18,996 feet. It is the 3rd highest peak in Ecuador. Obviously, climbing mountains like these is not something anyone can just casually decide to do on their day off. These long, steep slopes covered in rock and snow require professional skill. However, visitors sometimes choose to travel in groups with the help of an experienced guide, making scaling the summit a bit more attainable. As we'll soon see, this doesn't always pan out well. Despite having each other's support and the help of a guide, this nevertheless means that larger groups of people are moving in tandem up the slippery, technical mountainside. If, on the off chance something goes wrong, it can spell catastrophe. On Saturday, August 13th, 2022, a 7-person rope team was climbing up the side of Keri Huayrazo. Keri Huayrazo is the smallest of the 3 volcanoes in question, but it is still colossally high at just under 16,500 feet. It also sits right next to Ecuador's #1 tallest mountain, Chimborazo, which is over 20,000 feet tall. Climbing up to Keri Huayrazo's summit has always been a dangerous and demanding task, but recent decades have seen that task become significantly more difficult and more dangerous. Thanks to climate change, there is less snow near the top than there used to be. Instead of planting their mountaineering shoes into thick snow, climbers spend more and more time negotiating smooth, slick rocks, particularly as they get nearer to the volcano's summit. This is not good for arriving at the summit safely, and it's even worse for making your way back down. According to an article later published in Outside Magazine, climbers today must either climb up a sheer face or climb up a chimney, both of which have fairly high degrees of difficulty in both directions. That Saturday, the The 7-person group had already been to the summit and was making their way back down when trouble struck. Just a short way below the summit, the group had to traverse a relatively long stretch of steep, smooth snow. It would seem rope teams are vulnerable in situations like this, as one falling climber can cause a kind of domino effect that puts everyone in jeopardy. This is precisely what happened. Suddenly, one of the 7 climbers lost their footing. In just a few chaotic seconds, the whole group was falling down the side of Keriwairatso. Part of the reason this happened so dramatically was because, as later eyewitness accounts would reveal, the climbers were roped together unusually close, only about 4 or 5 feet apart. The fall that resulted from one of their members slipping and the group being roped too close together was not a small one. The 7 bound climbers fell at least 500 feet, probably more. 7 people who are tied loosely together falling 500 feet is bad enough, but things were about to get even worse. That's because directly below them were even more people. We can assume this was not the sight they wanted to see when they gazed up at the summit they were climbing towards. One of the climbers now standing in the undulating, expanding shadow of the fallen group was Edgar Vaca. Vaca is a climbing guide with more than 20 years of experience. He was not impressed by the expertise of the group above him. He was particularly critical of their guide, who he accused of being inexperienced and putting his group in excess danger. As Newton could have predicted, the group of 7 eventually crashed into the group below them. This finally broke their fall, but that wasn't the only thing that got broken. Vaca's wife, who was climbing alongside him, suffered several broken bones. Vaca says he suffered bruises and busted knees. The climbers who had fallen suffered much worse. 2 of them died right there on the mountainside. Another was rushed to the hospital but died before doctors could save them. Those who survived did so in excruciating pain, debilitated by newfound collections of shattered bones and other severe impact traumas. The Ecuadorian authorities had to launch a timely and elaborate rescue mission to extract this whole group of wounded people from the icy slopes of Keriwairatso. It was immediately obvious this was one of the worst mountaineering accidents in the area's history, but amazingly, the carnage was far from over. Slippery conditions were not unique to Keriwairatso that day. On the slopes of Ecuador's tallest volcano, Cayambe, about 260 kilometers north, another accident occurred. This involved 2 climbers who were on their way to the Peak Glacier, nearly 19,000 feet above sea level. Doing this involved a terrifyingly steep slope of rock that leads, almost like a grand finale, the rest of the way up to the very top. They'd come a long way to reach this daunting final stretch, but unfortunately things did not go well. Even though they were expecting it to be slippery and would have been cautious, the rock face still proved even more slippery than either climber could handle. Both of them slipped and lost their footing, and both of them fell. This could easily have resulted in their deaths, but instead, they survived the tumble. However, they were far from unscathed. Both climbers suffered broken legs, leaving them incapacitated near the top of one of Ecuador's highest peaks. This meant another emergency mountain rescue in Ecuador within the span of mere hours. About halfway between Keriwairatso and Cayambe are the Ilinisas. The Ilinisas are a pair of volcanoes. Both the north and south volcanoes are climbing destinations, but the south volcano, named Ilinisa Sur, is more difficult and dangerous to climb. This is largely due to ice. The glacial nature of Ilinisa Sur makes the climbing terrain more demanding than its northern neighbor. On Ecuador's so-called Black Day for mountaineering, this could only mean one thing. Sure enough, on the very same Saturday that saw 7 climbers fall onto 3 others on Keriwairatso and 2 climbers fall on Cayambe, Ilinisa Sur saw a climbing team of 3 attempting to climb to its summit as well. In order to reach Ilinisa Sur's 17,000-foot summit, the climbing team had to cross over from another lower peak on the mountain. This lower sub-peak is called Ambato. To get to the summit from Ambato, you have to cross over something called a saddle. This is a recognizable feature of this and other mountains around the world. Mountain saddles are often narrow, with steep drops on either side. Climbing groups will descend, then reascend along the spine of the saddle in a cautious, single-file line. This, as much as any other point during a climb, is a point at which you'd better not look down. Whether someone looked down when they shouldn't have or not, what happened on Ilinisa Sur that day is what every climber fears the most. The team of 3 climbers was roped together, similar to the team on Huayraso. When one of them slipped, they all slipped, and slipped right into a nightmare situation. From the spine of the saddle between Ambato and the summit, the tied-up team of 3 began to slide, and slide fast, horrifically fast. Not only that, but they were sliding towards an edge along the side of the mountain where the slope became significantly steeper, approximately 75 to 80 degrees. That's close enough to vertical that sliding over the lip, even at low speed, would be equivalent to skiing off a ramp. And these 3 out-of-control climbers were definitely not sliding at low speed. But then, a borderline miracle occurred that almost surely saved the climbers' lives. A crevasse right along the edge of the drop-off happened to be located directly underneath where the team had fallen from. This crevasse was fairly wide, but also fairly shallow. Experts would later say that they would not expect such a shallow crevasse to stop 3 adults who were sliding down the mountain at such uncontrolled high speed. But somehow, it did. All 3 climbers crashed into the crevasse, breaking bones and incurring gnarly bruises in the process. Their injuries were debilitating and left them in need of immediate rescue, but they ended up wedged in this small crevasse rather than flung over the side of the volcano. Shortly following this unbelievable day, the Ecuadorian Association of Mountain Guides made a Facebook post calling it, quote, "Un día negro para el montañismo," or a black day for mountaineering. They really were not exaggerating. From north to south along the Ecuadorian Andes, rescue helicopters and countless workers spent all day racing towards the nation's tallest mountains. What caused this extraordinary carnage? Well, the first thing to ask is to what degree it was in fact extraordinary. 68 volcanoes is a lot. What are the chances that on any given day 3 of them would see accident? While slipping and falling is an all too common occurrence in the Andes Mountains, this day in Ecuador was still very much a statistical anomaly. It wasn't just the number of accidents, but the deaths and severe injuries that abounded. To give you an idea of just how out of the ordinary this day was, if every day in Ecuador was as deadly as August 13th, 2022, then the average yearly death toll would be over 1,000. The annual average for mountaineering deaths across the entire planet, let alone Ecuador, is lower than that. In fact, surprisingly, statistics show that mountain climbers are more likely to be killed or injured driving to and from the mountain than while on the mountain itself. That's not to say that mountaineering is entirely safe, however, especially if you lack proper experience or training. And as Ecuador's Black Day shows, when things do go wrong on the mountain, they often go wrong in a big way. Kilimanjaro is one of the most visited mountains in the world. This is largely because although it is the tallest freestanding mountain on Earth, most climbing experts agree that nearly anybody in good health can reach the summit. But with so many visitors to such an unfamiliar environment, freak accidents do happen every once in a while. Our story today takes us back to the year 2016. This was the year when Kilimanjaro unexpectedly claimed the life of a young, well-known athlete, sending shockwaves across his community and making headlines around the world. Our story begins at Ora Tambo International Airport in Johannesburg, South Africa in mid-July of 2016. Amid the hustle and bustle of an airport that sees over 21 million passengers per year, a small group of volunteers gathers around the security gate to the international terminal. They are volunteers on behalf of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. In honor of the late South African president's upcoming birthday, the volunteers are participating in a charity event called Trek for Mandela. The goal of the event is a noble one: to raise awareness and funding to help prevent young women from missing school due to menstrual problems. According to organizations like UNICEF and the Amumba Foundation, girls from impoverished backgrounds can miss as many as 50 days of school per year without proper support. The annual fundraiser seeks to reduce that number and encourage more education and empowerment among South Africa's young women. The reason the volunteers have gathered here in front of airport security, however, is that in order to raise funds for the Nelson Mandela Foundation, the group will be flying nearly 2,000 miles to the East African country of Tanzania. There, they will enter the iconic 650 square mile national park where Mount Kilimanjaro stands and attempt to reach the summit on the date of July 18th, Nelson Mandela's birthday. The volunteer group includes author and activist Letzeho Zulu and her husband, 38-year-old Gugu Zulu. Gugu Zulu is a celebrated South African rally driver. He won several rally championships during his racing career and earned himself the affectionate nickname of the fastest brother in Africa. He also worked as a stunt driver for big-budget movies, including Lord of War starring Nicolas Cage. Also present at the airport is the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, Sello Hatang. Hatang was responsible for recruiting Gugu Zulu to join the climb, and he's excited to send Gugu and his wife off as they board the plane to Tanzania. As members of the group are all saying their goodbyes, Gugu approaches Hatang and thanks him for the invitation. Before turning to walk through airport security, Gugu also mentions to Hatang that he'd like to stay in touch and discuss future fundraising events that Gugu could also participate in. With that, they exchange farewells, and Gugu and Letzeho Zulu join the rest of the traveling groups as they pass through security and head to their boarding gate. A total of 46 people from South Africa are participating in the year's Trek for Mandela Challenge. But out of those 46, it could be said that Gugu Zulu and his wife Letzeho are the most publicly known and highly regarded. By this time, Gugu has won celebrity even outside the sphere of just rally driving. This is thanks to his becoming a motorsport television presenter. His warm, spirited personality has made Gugu Zulu popular even among those with little interest in racing. A year earlier, Gugu and his wife welcomed their first child, a daughter named Leletu. Together, the pair are known as a, quote, adventure couple, and according to the BBC, they are widely celebrated in South African sporting circles. In fact, Letzeho has even brought along a custom banner which says adventure couple. She plans to be photographed holding it alongside Gugu when they reach the summit. Kilimanjaro, the iconic mountain to which the adventure couple is now headed, is located in the north of Tanzania, only about 200 miles south of the equator. But despite sitting in the middle of this famously warm region, Kilimanjaro's peak remains distinctively capped with snow year-round. This unusual juxtaposition provides the backdrop to one of the world's most beautiful national parks. Among the acacia trees and across the golden grass of the Serengeti roam elephants, rhinos, giraffes, baboons, and numerous other animals. As you might therefore suspect, Kilimanjaro National Park is indeed a popular destination for safaris as well as for mountaineering. It is this remarkable Serengeti scene that greets Gugu and Letzeho Zulu along with 44 other South African volunteers as they arrive in Kilimanjaro National Park on Thursday, July 14, 2016. In total, the Kilimanjaro trek can take as long as 9 days to complete. Even though they are arriving in the park a full 4 days before the target summit date of Mandela's birthday, the group has to embark on their journey right away. On Saturday, July 16th, Gugu Zulu makes a Facebook post that says the following, quote, "Made it through day 2. My wife is doing fabulous. She's even learned the local language. I'm having flu-like symptoms and struggling with the mountain, but taking it step by step. Today, we managed to see our destination, and our camp is literally above the clouds." Though clearly in a positive mood, Gugu briefly mentions something a bit concerning. He's having flu-like symptoms. According to the team's medical doctor, Roxanne Schutta, something about Gugu seems a bit off as early as Thursday morning. She later tells a South African newspaper that she begins administering various treatments to Gugu from the very beginning of the expedition. At first, Gugu complains of an itchy throat. She assumes that Gugu is probably just experiencing some sinus irritation from all the dusty roads the group has walked on during the expedition so far. After all, he isn't the only person in the group to be complaining about such symptoms. Dr. Schutta starts out by simply giving Gugu some throat lozenges and vitamins. These seem to work initially, but she says that as the climb wears on, his condition begins to deteriorate further. According to Schutta, quote, "I had some sinus medication with me. I told him to take some painkillers, and I told him I would check him the following morning. He just looked a bit off. He was not his normal happy self. I could see he was taking strain." It's possible Gugu Zulu may have contracted some kind of virus before beginning the climb. As far as we know, he's never tested for anything. 2016 is, after all, still the pre-COVID era. On Sunday, the day before the group is supposed to reach the summit, Zulu is feeling even worse. As the climb starts to reach higher and higher points of elevation, his initial symptoms are now coupled with acute symptoms of altitude sickness. He's nauseous, soon unable to keep food down, and growing weaker by the hour. Dr. Schutte gives Gugu some anti-nausea medication and suggests they put him on an IV, which they fill with antioxidants and energy supplements. Gugu grows weaker still. At around 8 p.m. on the night of Sunday, July 17th, Dr. Schutte suddenly hears an eruption of screaming and shouting. She rushes towards the sound. She finds Gugu Zulu unconscious, his panicked wife by his side. Schutte immediately takes Gugu's vital signs. She finds a strong pulse, but she describes his breathing as, quote, rusty. Schutte orders that Gugu Zulu be placed on a stretcher and rushed to the hospital. In what seems like the span of mere hours, the beloved South African racing driver has moved from being mildly ill and taking mild supplements to needing emergency medical attention. Dr. Schutte knows that the single best thing for a patient suffering acute mountain sickness is a return to sub-4,000-foot altitude. Her expectation is that once the young, normally healthy Gugu Zulu reaches the Serengeti floor, his symptoms will begin to reverse all on their own. Nevertheless, to ensure his safety, they arrange for an ambulance to pick Gugu and his wife up and rush them to the nearest emergency room in Moshi, the capital city of the Kilimanjaro region. Under the glow of the Serengeti moon, the unconscious Gugu Zulu is carried on a stretcher, amid the chirpings of the night wildlife, to the bottom of the mountain. Friends and family are shocked at the news, and saddened to hear that neither Gugu nor Letseho will be reaching the summit of Kilimanjaro. However, they're relieved to know he is in the care of medical professionals. All assume, including Team Dr. Roxanne Schutte, that after some rest and readjustment, he'll make a speedy recovery. The following day, as the rest of the group reaches the summit and the world celebrates Mandela Day, news breaks that shocks everyone. 38-year-old Gugu Zulu has died in the hospital. It is a tragic blow no one is prepared for. Here is a quote from Team Dr. Roxanne Schutte upon hearing the news. Quote, "When you go down from the altitude, you become better. That's what I expected. When we heard the following day that Gugu had passed, we were all shocked. He wasn't ill. He had mild symptoms that most of the people in the group had because of the high altitude. Scratchy throat, blocked nose." Support and condolences quickly came pouring in online as news of Gugu's death breaks across national and international media. The president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, even issues a media statement saying, quote, "South Africa has lost an inspirational young man who was not only an adventure enthusiast, but was also passionate about community initiatives aimed at improving the lives of others." But with the outpouring of support, there are also some critical voices. As speculation swirls about what may or may not have been the 38-year-old's cause of death, one theory being meningitis, accusations are made that Gugu Zulu should not have continued attempting the climb for as long as he did, nor should the team he was climbing with have allowed, let alone encouraged, him to do so. Given the fact Zulu was experiencing symptoms of mild altitude sickness, some climbing experts argue that proper protocol would have seen Zulu waiting at least 24 hours before going any higher. Also pointed out is the fact that, although he was the only fatality, Zulu wasn't the only member of the expedition to need hospitalization. A woman with asthma was also admitted to the hospital before reaching the summit on July 18th. Perhaps the desire to arrive at the summit in time for Mandela Day played a role in the team's haste. All we know for certain today is that what was supposed to be a celebratory fundraising event turned into an unexpected nightmare that caused the death of a young, well-liked South African public figure. It's safe to say that no one on the expedition, no one from the Mandela Foundation, and least of all, Gugu Zulu himself were expecting the journey to be marred by death in the way it was. Roughly 98% of all those who attempt to summit Kilimanjaro do so successfully. It is rare for expeditions to have to turn back, and even rarer for climbers to encounter fatal illnesses during the climb. But as we've seen today, it can happen. And if it can happen to Gugu Zulu, it can happen to almost anyone.
The small town of Krebs, Oklahoma seems normal enough on the surface, but below ground it holds a dark and terrible secret. Krebs was home to the Osage Coal and Mining Company, which was at the heart of the town's economy. But one fateful day, Osage's coal mine would become a grave and the site of disaster that was the worst mining disaster in the state's history, and also one of the worst mining accidents of all time. But the 1892 incident wouldn't be the last time that the name Osage would make headlines in the mining community, as decades later a town bearing the Osage name would suffer a string of mining catastrophes that would haunt the nation for decades. Krebs is a small, quaint town that started when a post office was built in the area on February 10, 1886. However, this simple post office was part of the ongoing Trail of Tears, which is one of the darkest times in American history. Before the post office of Krebs was founded, the land belonged to the Choctaw Nation and lands that were called Indian Territory. Back then, the United States had a policy to remove Native American populations from U.S. land in exchange for land grants. These new lands would largely be sovereign, independent states, but some of these lands were also unorganized. Before Oklahoma became a U.S. state, it was home to a mix of unorganized, independent, so-called Indian Territory and the sovereign state of the Choctaw. The Choctaw Nation has roots dating back as far as the year 800 Common Era during the Mississippian era in the areas around present-day Alabama. By the year 1500, the Choctaw emerged as a distinct people with their own language and 3 different subcultures. They fought alongside the U.S. during the American Revolution and the War of 1812, only to get betrayed numerous times over the course of 20 years. The Choctaw were displaced to Oklahoma after the land was acquired from the Louisiana Purchase. After the Civil War, the U.S. adopted a new plan. Instead of forcing Native American populations onto new land, the U.S. decided to take the land they had originally offered and grant any remaining population citizenship. This was a huge controversy that can still be a heated topic to this day. The land the Choctaw were originally forced onto was subdivided by the U.S. federal government with the Dawes Act, and their territory became known as Oklahoma Territory. The Choctaw were then shoved around once more when Oklahoma became a state in 1907. As Krebs began to develop alongside the region's impending statehood, companies from around the country started to eye the place for potential business opportunities. The Osage Coal and Mining Company capitalized on the U.S. government's change in policy to become the first commercial mining company on Native American territory. Shortly after, the Atoka Coal and Mining Company also set up shop on the newly taken land. Both Osage and Atoka were subsidiaries of the Missouri Pacific Railroad, or MOPAC, which was one of the first railroads in operation west of the Mississippi River. Prior to mining on Native American land, the Osage Coal and Mining Company also had mines in Missouri and Kansas. Osage's first acquisition came in 1872 with a mine 3 miles east of McAllister at the newly christened town of Krebs. The Choctaw's law enabled the person who discovered any minerals to lease the land in a 1-mile radius. Royalties on that land were paid to the finder and to both the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. While the royalties would have been far greater if the Choctaw didn't have more invaders to lay claim to their land, MOPAC paid a total of roughly $2 million over the course a little over 20 years, adjusted for inflation that comes to about $48 million. Over that same span of time, Osage mined 226,523 tons of coal. They paid rock-bottom prices at only 60 cents per ton of raw coal. Osage's operation in Krebs was leased to the company from a man named William Pulsey in 1875. To make matters worse for the Choctaw, Osage was a direct competitor. Up until the U.S. changed their policy, the Choctaw were already mining their lands. At the time, they held one of the strongest mining companies in the United States, and Osage's invasion threatened to dethrone the Choctaw. At the time of their Krebs acquisition, Osage was the 4th highest-ranked mining operation with a total of 800 employees. Osage employed mostly English and Irish miners looking to make their American dream a reality, but in Krebs, the mining population was comprised of mostly Italian and Russian immigrants. Eventually, the Italian heritage of the town gave Krebs its modern nickname, Oklahoma's Little Italy. The Industrial Revolution started at the end of the 1700s, which gave rise to new mining technologies and new reforms for workers' rights. However, miners were still faced with notoriously difficult conditions. Even if miners survived the dangers of the cramped, dark stone, they were often faced with chronic lung diseases and hearing loss. Unfortunately, unsafe working conditions were a part of life for the workers at Krebs.
Because the land was held on Native American soil, the mines weren't subject to federal regulations. This meant that there were even less regulations compared with other mines. Krebs' lack of federal laws made it an attractive place for companies like Osage. Fewer regulations meant the company could save money by skipping safety features, skipping survey work, and reducing or ignoring equipment and infrastructure maintenance. Osage squeezed even more money out of their miners by forcing them to work long hours without proper training periods for new miners. These short-term money-saving solutions would end up costing the lives of hundreds of works and mark the beginning of the end for the company. All of these factors were at play at Osage's number 11 mine at Krebs, where they employed old mining techniques. Old techniques known as conventional mining used what's called blast mining. Miners began by cutting into the coal bed to make it easier to break apart, then they would use dynamite or other explosives to quickly break apart coal seams. The coal and waste rubble were then loaded onto shuttle cars and conveyors. Other workers would then sift through the material and ship the coal off-site. This mining method dates back to the year 1627, when Hungary started using gunpowder instead of pickaxes and other tools. On January 7th, a newly hired miner accidentally set flame to a stockpile of explosives, which sent an enormous blast through the mine. Explosive stockpiles were stored near the surface and away from the actual blast sites to avoid triggering an unwanted chain reaction. Whenever a blast was scheduled, dynamite would be transferred to new coal beds where cutting patterns were already created. Then holes would be drilled to place the dynamite into the rock to improve its ability to break apart the stone. Miners would then be evacuated above ground. Since the explosion came without warning, miners didn't have time to escape. The blast collapsed lower sections of the mine, and miners were trapped or crushed under tons of rubble. But the miners who were transporting materials or taking a break near the surface were the most vulnerable, since the stockpile was near heavily trafficked parts of the mine. The blast burned nearby workers, and others were killed instantly by the high-pressure blast. Almost every household in Krebs either had someone working in the mines or were related to someone in the mines. The incident caused widespread panic in the growing town of Krebs. The catastrophe was called the third worst mining accident of the 19th century at the time, and it remains the worst mining disaster in Oklahoma's history. The total death toll ranges between 67 and 100 men, while another 200 miners suffered injuries. Eventually, in 2002, the town of Krebs created a memorial site where the old mine used to stand. The memorial holds the names of those who died at the 1892 Krebs mining disaster. Over the coming years, Osage fought a social battle on multiple fronts. On one hand, they had to deal with pressure from local populations that they were displacing, and they also had to contend with low morale from their own workers who dealt with poor work conditions with little pay. The company tired to make a step in the right direction in 1896 when Superintendent of Mining for Osage, William Cameron, invented the long wall system of mining. Longwall mines use machines to mine long veins of coal in a single slice rather than breaking the coal haphazardly with explosives. As machines cut the coal with large slices, the overhanging waste rock can fall in a controlled way. This system improved productivity while also creating a safer workplace environment. The longwall system was so effective that most large mining operations adopted it, and today, longwall mining accounts for over 50% of all underground mining production. But the longwall method was too little and too late for Osage. In 1894, miners organized a large-scale protest which shut down most of Osage's operations on Native American territory. These protests eventually resulted in the creation of the first installation of the United Mine Workers on Native American soil. Later in 1912, the town rebounded, and entrepreneurial coal miners created a weekly newspaper called the Oklahoma Miner. The Great Depression of 1929 was the last straw for Osage's operations in Oklahoma. In 1929, the company shut down its number 11 mine at Krebs and auctioned off its remaining equipment. However, that wasn't the last time the name Osage would be at the center of tragedy. The 1942 Osage mine catastrophe. Alongside the Choctaw Nation were the people of the Osage Nation. Like the Choctaw, they have a long history dating back to the year 700 CE. The name Osage actually comes from French settlers who discovered the tribe and named them after a phrase which means calm water, while the Osage referred to themselves as the Washaji, or Midwaters. Despite the mistranslation, an unincorporated town sprang up in West Virginia named Osage. This West Virginia community also became a mining operation in the mid-1900s. Instead of the Osage Coal and Mining Company laying claim to the community that shared their name, the mining operation at Osage, West Virginia, was ran by the Christopher Coal Company and the Pursglove Company. At Christopher Coal's number 3 mine in Osage, someone left a ventilation door open which diverted the flow of fumes and returned them back into the mine. Over the course of the day on May 12, 1942, methane gas built up in one of the mine shafts. There, the methane built up pressure, and the gas mixed with dust in the air to allow electricity to flow more freely through the air. At 2:25 p.m., a spark arced across one of the mining machines and set off a huge explosion as the methane caught fire. The ventilation equipment was the first to explode, and the pressure triggered sections of the roof to collapse. Once the explosion died down, rescue operations went underway. But even after the workers were saved, the disaster continued as 3 more miners suffocated in the unbreathable fumes of what are called afterdamp gases. In total, 56 people died that day at Osage, West Virginia. Then, in July of that same year, Osage, West Virginia was hit by another mining disaster when a roof collapsed at Pursglove's No. 2 mine. This collapse caused an explosion which killed 20 more miners. The string of mining tragedies associated with the Osage name finally came to an end in 1943 after one more disaster. This time, a vehicle that hauled coal in and out of the mine caught fire. This fire spread to the coal seam itself, which killed another 12 people, bringing the total death toll in the town of Osage to 89, and putting the overall mining deaths associated with the Osage name to close to 200. That's the tragic tale of how the Osage namesake left a string of disasters in the mining community. First, with the Osage Coal and Mining Company at Krebs, Oklahoma, and later at Osage, West Virginia. In spite of the catastrophes in the mining industry, mining remains an important part of many communities around the country.
In the decades following the 1926 eruption and the decimation of the town of Ho'opuloa, a newfound fear of the world's largest volcano, Mauna Loa, had taken hold on the island of Hawaii. Despite multiple incidents that would reliably send everyone into a panic, it wouldn't be until 1950 that everyone's fears were eventually realized in full. That's the year Mauna Loa let out the biggest eruption in its entire modern history. It was June 1st, just weeks before the start of summer in the tropical paradise of Hawaii. In 1950, it was still 9 years away from becoming a U.S. state, but Hawaii was already a major vacation destination, particularly for residents of the United States. World War II had ended 5 years earlier, and the U.S. was experiencing an economic boom like no other. Traveling to a warm, relaxing island paradise for a vacation was just the thing many felt like they needed. But of course, Hawaii is more than just a peaceful fantasy land. It's a remote island chain formed by explosive lava deep under the Earth's surface. And that day, the people on the Big Island were about to get a very dramatic wake-up call. The first signs that something was coming appeared about a week earlier. On March 25th, just before the crack of dawn, an earthquake shook people awake in their hotel beds. It wasn't big enough to do much damage, but everybody felt it, whether they were in the East Coast town of Hilo or the West Coast town of Kona. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the shaking stopped. Startled, but perhaps hoping it was just something the island does every once in a while, most visitors went back to sleep, naively thinking this would be the last they'd hear from the island's natural forces. That hope was shattered 4 days later on March 29th. In the middle of the afternoon, another earthquake struck. Now, if the last quake had been enough to startle the people on the island, well, this one was enough to scare the living hell out of them. It clocked in at a magnitude of 6.4 on the Richter scale. Earthquakes of that magnitude are relatively quite rare, and in populated areas they can inflict significant damage to people and property. Residents of Kona reported damage as serious as the destruction of stone walls and water tanks. As far as we know, nobody was killed, but there was a definite shift in the attitude of those who were there at the time. One mild earthquake is easily brushed off. 2, within the span of a few days, with the second being significantly stronger than the first, is a sign that something sinister might be brewing. Whether they knew it or not, something was brewing, and it was brewing directly beneath their feet. Lava. The earthquakes, which were coming in what geologists call a swarm, signaled that Mauna Loa was in a state of growing unrest. Geologists working on the island had been aware of this unrest for months. Through very precise surveying, they had observed that Kilauea, Mauna Loa's volcanic next-door neighbor, had actually tilted slightly. This was the result of a process called deformation, which happens when magma is moving underneath the surface of the Earth. To produce a measurable tilt at another volcano nearby, Mauna Loa had to have been experiencing very significant amounts of magma movement. But as far as anybody knew, this wasn't a sure sign of any imminent catastrophe. There's always magma moving around beneath Hawaii, and a sudden increase doesn't necessarily mean there will be an eruption. It was just something for scientists to keep a close eye on. What followed next would all happen very quickly and with little warning. After a day of tranquil sunshine, the sun had set over Hawaii on June 1st. The memory of the unsettling earthquake from a few days before was just starting to wear off, perhaps with the help of a few strawberry daiquiris. At 9 p.m., most tourists had paid their dinner bill and were either out dancing to a jukebox or back at the hotel putting the kids to bed. But by 9:30, everything on the island had changed. Following another swarm of earthquakes, this time in much more rapid succession, people were all at once able to see a hellish orange glow coming from high in the sky at the center of the island behind them. It's possible that even now visitors would have been perplexed as to what was going on, but surely the local residents knew. Mauna Loa was erupting, and the skyward glow was lava pouring out of the summit. In the night sky, this would have been hard to see, but above the summit of Mauna Loa there was also a huge mushroom cloud reaching toward the heavens. This cloud, made of volcanic gas emissions, would eventually rise as high as 10,000 feet above the summit of Mauna Loa, almost 24,000 feet above the surrounding sea. A fissure had opened at the top of the mountain that was roughly 2.5 miles long. Like a colossal wound, this fresh gash in Mauna Loa was spewing molten lava out and down the side toward the west. Worse still, the wound kept growing. In their record of the event, the U.S. Geological Survey described what happened as, quote, unzipping. By 10:30, an 11-mile trail of lava fountains wound down the side of Mauna Loa, all of them bursting and bubbling simultaneously. Now, there are two things in particular about these lava fountains that are amazing. First, they were high volume and extremely large. Along this 11-mile trail, which must have looked like the Bellagio from hell, there were fountains spouting as high as 200 feet in the air. At times, quick bursts were seen rising as high as almost 300 feet in the air. Just so you know, that's not that far off from the actual height of the Bellagio fountain show in Las Vegas. Only instead of water, it was 2,000-degree lava, and instead of being 1,000 feet wide, it was 11 miles. Oh, and don't forget, instead of being human-operated, it was completely out of human control, and heading for places where lots of humans were located. Which brings us to the second thing that was so extraordinary. These lava fountains were producing lava flows down the side of the volcano, and to date, they are the fastest-moving lava flows ever recorded at Mauna Loa. Within 3 hours, a major lava flow had traveled all the way down the mountain and reached the ocean in South Kona. Other flows were not far behind, slithering back and forth on the way down and overlapping like braids. The flow that only took 3 hours was called the Honokua flow, so named because of the town it threatened upon its initial emergence around 12:20 a.m. At 12:20, the flow was roughly a mile or so above Highway 11, which connects Hilo to Kona by running around the perimeter of the island. But just 10 minutes later, by 12:30, the Honokua flow had rolled right over the highway. It then proceeded in the very unfortunate direction of a gas station, which it blew up and destroyed. It also destroyed more than a few homes before the grand finale. On a remote island full of visitors before the age of cell phones, it destroyed the local post office. Other flows were not much kinder. A few hours later, the early morning hours of June 2nd, another flow called the Kaoe flow also barreled over the crippled highway, only a little over a mile south of where the last flow had split it in half. Several more homes were decimated completely by this second flow. The flow also had the nerve to knock over and then meld a huge row of coconut trees, replacing the tranquil scenery with fire, smoke, and ash. As the day broke over Hawaii on June 2nd, the chaos continued to build upon itself. Around noon, A group of people consisting of police, observatory personnel, and just plain maniacs wanting to look at the eruption were all congregated along Highway 11. They were, for their own various reasons, looking to try and see yet another major flow called the Ka'apuna flow that was headed their way. The National Guard, whose planes were watching the lava race toward these people from above, made contact with the crowd and suggested that they go away. Thankfully, the warning was heeded, and less than 2 hours later, the Ka'apuna flow ripped right through the already mangled Highway 11. It was estimated at the time that lava was racing toward the ocean at speeds of up to 30 miles an hour, significantly faster than even gold medal Olympic sprinters running at full speed. You could not outrun it, you definitely could not withstand it, and nobody could do much of anything to stop it. All anybody could do was try their best to get out of the way and say farewell to whatever they left behind, whether cars, houses, or anything else. The last new flow to form was the Kahuku flow, emerging very early on June 3rd. However, the existing lava flows continued for an astonishing 23 days. This polluted the air tremendously with a unique smog scientists call VOG. Part of what was clouding the air even further was steam from the ocean. Multiple lava flows actually continued down the side of the volcano underwater, remaining hot enough to continue along their melty path. Observatory personnel actually had a pretty cool way of tracking how far these underwater lava flows went, by looking at the trails of steam above them. Astoundingly, the furthest made it about a half mile out to sea before finally solidifying. When it was all finally over 23 days later, Mauna Loa had spit out a record-breaking 376 million cubic meters of lava onto the island. That's close to 100 billion gallons. Miraculously, nobody was killed, thanks to the work of local authorities to keep the public safe and out of the way of the flows. Property on the island wasn't so lucky, however. The 1950 eruption destroyed around 24 buildings, including a gas station and a post office. It also ruined the highway. In a series of swift, messy slices, it left about a mile of the highway missing in total. Such a massive eruption at such a pivotal time in Hawaii's history impacted public perception of the islands. The general public, particularly tourists, were more aware of the volcanic aspect of Hawaii's idyllic allure. Many were fascinated and drawn even more toward this boon for natural exploration. Others were frightened and perhaps discouraged from visiting. The truth is that your chances of being killed by a volcanic eruption when visiting Hawaii are infinitesimally small. Less than 100 people have died in the recorded history of the island, and with technological advances in seismic monitoring and communications, it gets less and less likely every decade. Still, Mauna Loa is an undeniable force to be reckoned with. Its ability to spontaneously impose its will on the visitors and residents of the island, and to make them watch helplessly while infrastructure and property get liquefied, is pretty terrifying. We can only hope that one day Mauna Loa won't break its own record and let out an even bigger eruption than it did in 1950.
Have you ever gotten lost during a call, calling your parents saying you see lights from a town miles away, but those lights shouldn't be there? That's what happened to Brandon Swanson. He vanished that night, and the mystery of what happened to him continues to this day. Swanson's journey began in Marshall, a small but vibrant town in southwestern Minnesota. Marshall is the county seat of Lyon County, meaning it is the main town where county government offices are located. Growing up in this community, Swanson attended Marshall High School. In 2007, Swanson graduated from Marshall High School. Graduating from high school is a big step in a young person's life. It means they have completed their basic education and are ready to move on to new opportunities. For Swanson, this next step was to learn more about wind turbines. Wind turbines are large structures that use wind to create electricity. They are an important part of renewable energy, which helps to reduce the use of fossil fuels. Swanson chose to study wind turbines at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. This college has several campuses, and Swanson attended the one in Canby. Canby is a small town not far from Marshall, making it a convenient choice for Swanson. He spent a year there, gaining valuable knowledge and skills in the field of wind energy. This period of study was important for Swanson as it helped him learn about an emerging and important technology. Wind turbines are becoming more common as the world looks for cleaner sources of energy. By studying at Minnesota West Community and Technical College, Swanson prepared himself for a career in this growing industry. Classes at Minnesota West Community and Technical College finished for the academic year on May 13, 2008. To celebrate, Swanson stayed in Canby that evening and joined his friends for parties and fun. He attended 2 different parties where people saw him drinking alcohol. However, his friends mentioned that he didn't appear to be very drunk despite having some drinks. Swanson left Canby late at night, planning to drive the 48 kilometers back to his home. It was a long day of celebrating the end of classes, and he wanted to get back home. Before midnight, he got into his Chevrolet Lumina and started the journey. Just before 2 a.m., Swanson used his cell phone to call his parents. He was calm, but a bit worried. He told them that while driving, he had accidentally driven off the road and into a ditch. His car was stuck in the ditch, and he couldn't get it out by himself.
He said he was fine, but he was not injured. No damage to the vehicle.
Swanson asked his parents to come and help him. He needed them to pick him up because he couldn't continue the drive home with his car stuck. Annette and Brian Swanson got into their pickup truck and drove to where they thought Brandon was. They kept talking to him on the phone, even though the call sometimes got cut off. Brandon stayed with his car and tried to help his parents find him. He turned his car lights on and off to signal them, but they couldn't see the lights. He also couldn't see their lights when they tried the same thing. Both sides were trying hard to find each other, but it was difficult in the dark and with the phone calls dropping. They were getting worried, but kept trying to connect. Brandon finally decided to leave his car. He told his parents that he could see some lights in the distance and thought they were from the town of Lind, which is about 11 kilometers southwest of Marshall. He believed he was close to Lind and decided to walk towards those lights. Brandon told his father to drive to the parking lot of a local bar in Lind and wait for him there. As Brian drove to the bar, he kept talking to Brandon on the phone. They hoped this plan would help them find each other more easily. Shortly after 2:30 a.m., while Brandon was still on the phone with his father, he suddenly said, "Oh shit." After that, he went silent and didn't say anything else. His parents stayed on the call for a while, but there was no response from Brandon. They eventually hung up and tried calling him back many times, but he didn't answer. Since that moment, no one has seen or heard from Brandon. At 6:30 a.m., Brandon's parents, Annette and Brian Swanson, reported him missing to the Lind police. They were very worried because they hadn't heard from him since the phone call when he suddenly went silent. They knew something was wrong. When they spoke to the police, they were initially told that it was not unusual for young men Brandon's age to stay out all night, especially after finishing their last day of college classes. The police seemed to think that Brandon might just be out having fun and that he would show up soon. Annette Swanson clearly remembered that one of the officers told them it was Brandon's right to be missing. This meant that the officer thought Brandon had the freedom to go off on his own if he wanted to, and there wasn't much they could do about it right away. Despite this response, Annette and Brian were very concerned. They knew their son and felt that this situation was different and more serious. They were desperate to find Brandon and hoped the police would start looking for him as soon as possible. Later that morning, the Lind police began searching for Brandon, but they didn't find any signs of him in the town or nearby areas. They asked the Lyon County Sheriff Joel Dahl and his team to help with the search. To figure out where Brandon might be, the sheriff's office got his cell phone records. These records showed that Brandon had been calling from an area near Taunton, which is along State Highway 68. This is the main road to Canby and is northwest of Marshall, about 40 kilometers from Lind. This information helped them focus their search in the right area. While searching in that area, deputies found Brandon's car stranded in a ditch along a gravel road near the Lincoln County line. The car was about a mile north of Highway 68. This discovery brought the sheriff of Lincoln County, Jack Vizecki, into the investigation. Sheriff Vizecki told the media that Brandon's Chevrolet Lumina was stuck on a small hill at the edge of the road. The car wasn't seriously damaged, but it was stuck in a way that the wheels on one side couldn't touch the ground properly. There didn't seem to be anything else wrong with the car. Because the ground around it was covered with grass and gravel, there were no tracks to show which way Brandon might have gone when he left the car. This made it harder for the deputies to figure out where he might be. Brandon's cell phone call was traced back to a tower near Minneota, which is another town along Highway 68. This tower is located at the intersection of County Routes 3 and 10. Investigators found out that Brandon's call came from somewhere within a 5-mile radius of this tower by May 15th. Because of this information, searchers focused their efforts on this area. It was important to search within this radius to try and find Brandon. Some parts of this area also stretched into Yellow Medicine County to the north. Authorities from that area also joined the search to help find Brandon. Sheriff Dahl noticed that from the area where Brandon's car was found, you could see a red light on top of a grain elevator in Taunton. He thought that Brandon might have seen this light and thought that Lind was close enough to walk to from there. To help with the search, they had teams on the ground looking for Brandon. They also had an aerial team flying over the area to look for any signs of him from above. Search dogs were brought in from the Twin Cities to help track Brandon's scent. A team of bloodhounds from Codington County, South Dakota also joined the search. These dogs picked up a scent trail that stretched about 3 miles. The trail mostly followed field roads heading west-northwest until it reached an abandoned farm. Then it continued along the Yellow Medicine River until it seemed to go into the water. This gave searchers some clues about where Brandon might have gone. Brandon's father remembered Brandon saying that he had passed fences and heard water nearby. Because of this, there was a concern that Brandon might have fallen into the water and drowned. To cover all possibilities, boats from the state's Department of Natural Resources were sent to search along the river. Gates were also put up in certain areas as a safety measure. The water in some parts of Lincoln County had been quite deep on the morning Brandon went missing, but it had gone down since then. Deputies walked along the banks of the river looking for any signs of Brandon. They also used horses and all-terrain vehicles to search the surrounding areas. However, Sheriff Dahl decided against organizing a large-scale ground search at that time. Once the initial search didn't find any trace of Brandon, most of the efforts to find him were stopped. However, Sheriff Visecki didn't give up hope. He walked along the 2 miles of the Yellow Medicine River in that area every day for a whole month. He wanted to make sure they didn't miss anything just in case Brandon was still out there. Meanwhile, Brandon's parents, the Swansons, kept their porch light on every night. They did this as a symbol of their hope that Brandon would come back, or that they would find him. Even now, they still keep the porch light on every night, holding on to their hope that Brandon will eventually be found. Searches started again, later in the fall, after the fields where Brandon went missing had been harvested. Dogs were brought in to help with the searches, and they followed scents that led them to an area northwest of Porter. This area hadn't been searched before, so it was important to check it thoroughly. Efforts to find Brandon continued into the spring after the snow melted, but before new plants were put in the fields. This pattern continued through 2011, with searches happening in the fall and spring each year. By 2011, search teams had covered an area of about 122 square miles trying to find any sign of Brandon. In 2010, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, BCA, took charge of the investigation into Brandon's disappearance. They became the main agency handling the case. As part of their efforts to gather information, they set up a tip line. People could call in with any information they had about Brandon's whereabouts or what might have happened to him. By 2015, the tip line had received around 90 leads from the public. As the investigation continued, the focus shifted towards Mud Creek, which is a smaller river that flows into the Yellow Medicine River. This area, located to the north and northwest of Porter, became of interest to the authorities. They believed that there might be clues there that could help solve the mystery of Brandon's disappearance. Even though one of the search dogs followed a trail to the Yellow Medicine River, Brandon's mother, Annette Swanson, doesn't believe he drowned there. The dog's trail continued across the river and along the riverbank to another gravel road. Then, it headed north towards the Yellow Medicine County line and stopped there. Annette told CNN that there's nothing to suggest Brandon is in the river. Brandon's father, Brian Swanson, also remembers their phone conversations from that night. Despite having some drinks earlier, Brandon didn't sound confused or disoriented during their talks. If Brandon Swanson is still alive, there are a few other possibilities to consider, although they seem unlikely. One possibility is that he intentionally chose to disappear, but his parents don't think that's something he would do. Sheriff Visecki mentioned that he couldn't rule out the chance of foul play, even though there's no evidence to support it. He speculated that someone might have been hiding and could have harmed Brandon without anyone seeing. These are just theories, and it's hard to say for sure what happened to Brandon. His family and the authorities continue to search for answers and hope to find him soon. Even after all the searches, Annette Swanson still remembers how the Lind police initially reacted when she told them about her son's age. They said he had the right to be missing, but as his mother, she knew something was seriously wrong. Annette and Brian Swanson decided to push for changes in state laws. They wanted laws that would make it mandatory to start an investigation as soon as an adult goes missing, just like it is for missing children. They believed this change could help families like theirs get help faster when a loved one disappears. Annette met with Marty Seifert, who was the minority leader of the State House of Representatives at that time. They met in a local restaurant to talk about the difficulties she faced with the police when she reported her son missing. Seifert remembered their conversation in 2015, saying that Annette knew it might not change anything for her son's case, but she hoped it could make a difference for others in the future. Seifert proposed a bill named Brandon's Law. This bill aimed to make the necessary change by adjusting the law that oversees the state's existing missing child program. The change involved replacing the word child with person. Seifert faced some challenges initially, especially from the state's law enforcement community as the bill was being developed in committee. He mentioned that part of the resistance was because of concerns about privacy, especially regarding cell phones. At that time, technology was advancing, and there were discussions about when law enforcement could track a person's location through their cell phone and when they couldn't. Dennis Frederickson brought a similar bill to the state Senate. After both the Senate and the House passed the bill, Governor Tim Pawlenty signed it into law in May 2009. The Swansons and their daughter Jamin were present at the ceremony when the law was signed. The change brought about by Brandon's Law means that police not only have to confirm that the reported person is missing, but also assess if that person might be in danger. They are also required to quickly inform nearby law enforcement agencies. The law also makes it clear that the agency receiving the report is the main one investigating the case. This clarification was needed because during the initial search there were issues when different counties were involved. Now, police can't refuse to take a missing person report just because they think no crime has occurred, or if it's only been a short time since the person was last seen, or if there's a possibility the person left on purpose, or if there's no relationship between the person reporting and the missing person. After the governor signed the bill, the law started working in July 2009. This means that from that time, the changes made by the law became official and were put into action. Since then, 4 other states have passed laws similar to Brandon's Law. This shows that the changes made by Brandon's Law were important and could help people in other places too. Seifert, who proposed the bill, left his position in the legislature in 2010. However, he still keeps the pen that Governor Pawlenty used to sign the bill into law. He considers this bill one of the most important ones he worked on during his 14 years in the legislature. He believes that this law can make a real difference and even save lives. As years crawled by, hope dwindled for Brandon's family. The search parties disbanded, the helicopters fell silent. But for Annette and Brian, the search never truly ended. Every sunrise brought a renewed flicker of hope, every sunset, a crushing weight of unanswered questions. Brandon's story is a stark reminder that darkness can lurk in the most unexpected places. It's a chilling tale of a young life tragically cut short, a mystery that continues to baffle investigators and haunt a small town. In 1996, it's a bright summer Sunday, perfect for the beach. 3 siblings ask their mom to take them for some fun at the beach. But that happy day takes a horrifying turn when the kids vanish without a trace. What happened on that fateful day in Australia? Let's explore the mystery of 3 kids. 9 years Jane, 7 years Arna, and 4 years old Grant Beaumont lived with their parents, Jim Beaumont, who was a former serviceman and a taxi driver, and Nancy Beaumont. The couple had gotten married in December 1955. The family made their home at 109 Harding Street in Somerton Park, South Australia, a suburb of Adelaide. They were not far from Glenelg Beach, a popular spot that the children liked to visit often. On 25 January 1966, during a hot summer heat wave, Jim took the children to Glenelg Beach and dropped them off before leaving for a 3-day sales trip to Snowtown. On the morning of 26th of January, which was Australia Day, the Beaumont children asked their mother if they could go to Glenelg Beach again. Since it was too hot to walk, they decided to take a short bus ride instead. The bus journey was about 3 kilometers and only took 5 minutes. Nancy, trusting her children's independence, gave them some money and permission to take a bus to Glenelg. The children caught the bus at 8:45 a.m. and were expected to come back home on the 12 p.m. noon bus. The children planned to buy some pastries with their pocket money and spend the day playing on the beach, a familiar haunt. They were well behaved and known in the neighborhood. Nancy started to worry when the children didn't return on the 12 p.m. bus or the 2 p.m. bus. However, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows on the sand, the Beaumont children never returned home. When Jim came home early from his business trip around 3 p.m., he immediately went to the busy beach to look for them. Unable to find the children, he went back home, and he and Nancy began searching the neighborhood and visiting friends' houses. By around 5:30 p.m., they went to the Glenelg police station to report that their children were missing. The police quickly organized a search of Glenelg Beach and the nearby areas, thinking that the Beaumont children were close by and had just lost their way. The search then widened to include the sand hills, the ocean, and nearby buildings. Authorities also monitored the airport, rail lines, and interstate roads in case of an accident or kidnapping. The news spread like a fire within 24 hours. The whole country knew about the case. Within 3 days, on 29 January, the Adelaide Sunday Mail had a headline saying, "Sex crime now feared," showing the growing worry that the children had been abducted and possibly murdered by a sex offender. Despite this alarming development, the initial official reward was only $250.
On 29 January, the Padawalonga boat haven was drained after a woman informed the police that she had seen and talked to 3 children who matched the descriptions of the Beaumont children near the haven at 7 p.m. on the day they disappeared. Police cadets and members of the emergency operations group thoroughly searched the area, but they did not find anything. Police investigating the case found several witnesses who had seen the Beaumont children at Collie Reserve near Glenelg Beach. They were with a tall man who had fair to light brown hair, a thin face, and looked to be in his mid-30s. He had a suntanned complexion and a thin, too athletic build, and he was wearing swim trunks. The children seemed to be relaxed and enjoying themselves while playing with him. One of the witnesses reported that the man had approached and asked them if anyone had been near the children's belongings because their money was missing. After that, the man went off to change clothes while the children waited for him. Later, all of them were seen walking away from the beach together, which the police estimated to be around 12:15 p.m. About 2.5 hours later, another witness, Miss Daphne Gregory, saw the children with the same man. She noticed that he was carrying an airline bag similar to one owned by Jane. The Beaumont parents mentioned that their children, especially Jane, were usually shy, so seeing them play so confidently with a stranger was unusual. Investigators thought that maybe the children had met this man before during previous visits to the beach and had grown to trust him. There was a small remark made at home that seemed irrelevant at the time, but later supports this theory. Arna mentioned to her mother that Jane had a boyfriend down the beach. Nancy assumed it was just a playmate and didn't think much of it until after the children disappeared. A shopkeeper at the nearby Wenzel's Bakery located on Mosley Street told the police that Jane had bought pasties and a meat pie using a $1 note. This raised doubt because of 2 reasons. First, the shopkeeper knew the Beaumont children well from previous visits and said that they had never bought a meat pie before. Second, the children's mother had only given them 6 shillings and 6 pence, which was just enough for their bus fare and lunch, not $1. Police believed that someone else must have given them the extra money. According to an initial report, the Beaumont children were spotted walking alone at 2:55 p.m., away from the beach along Jetty Road towards the direction of their home. The witness, who was a postman and knew the children well, said they were holding hands and laughing as they walked along the main street. This witness was considered reliable by the police. It was confusing why the usually reliable children who were already an hour late were walking alone and didn't seem worried. 2 days later, the postman contacted the police again and said he might have seen them in the morning, not the afternoon as he said before. Days turns into weeks, weeks into months, but there was no sign of Jane, Arna, or Grant. Several months later, a woman came forward with a strange story. She said that on the night the children disappeared, she saw a man with 2 girls and a boy enter a neighboring house that she thought was empty. Later that night, she saw the boy walking alone in a nearby lane. The man chased after him and grabbed him roughly. The next morning, the house seemed empty again, and she didn't see the man or the children again. The police failed to establish why she hadn't shared this information earlier. There were other sightings of the children reported for about a year after they went missing. The Beaumont case gained attention worldwide. On 8th of November 1966, Gerard Croiset, a psychic from the Netherlands, was brought to Australia to help with the search. This caused a lot of excitement in the media. However, Croiset's efforts didn't lead to any success. His story kept changing and he didn't provide any useful clues. Croiset pointed out a spot at a warehouse near the children's home where he believed their bodies might be buried. The property owners were hesitant to dig based only on a psychic's claim, but public pressure, fueled by media attention, pushed them to demolish the building after raising a $40,000. However, no remains or evidence linked to the Beaumont family were found. In 1996, when the building identified by Croiset was partially demolished, the owners allowed a thorough search of the site. Once again, nothing was found relating to the children. About 2 years after the children went missing, the Beaumont parents received 2 letters. One supposed to be from Jane, and the other was from a man who said he was taking care of the children. Both letters were postmarked from Dandenong, Victoria. The letters described a pleasant situation and mentioned the man who was looking after them. Police thought the letters might be real, especially after comparing them to others written by Jane. The letter from the man said he had made himself the children's guardian and was ready to give them back to their parents. A meeting place was mentioned in the letter. The Beaumont parents, along with a detective, went to the meeting spot, but nobody was there. Later, they received a 3rd letter also, supposedly from Jane, saying that the man had seen a detective and decided not to give back the children because he felt betrayed by the Beaumonts. After that, there were no more letters received. In 1992, new forensic tests showed that the letters were fake. Improved fingerprint technology identified a 41-year-old man who had been a teenager at the time as the author. He wrote the letters as a prank, and because so much time had passed, he wasn't charged with any crime. In November 2013, digging started behind a factory in North Plimpton that used to belong to Harry Phipps, a possible suspect in the Beaumont case. They also dug again in a slightly different spot on the site in February 2018. Unfortunately, they didn't find anything relevant. The reason for the digging was that two men said that when they were boys, Phipps paid them to dig a hole in that area around the time the children disappeared. Also, tests showed there was unusual soil in that spot. However, in 2018, all they found were animal bones. There was no evidence connected to the Beaumont children. Bevan Spencer von Einem, born in 1946, was sentenced to life in prison in 1984 for killing Richard Kelvin, the son of an Adelaide newsreader. Police suspected von Einem had helpers and might have been involved in more murders, including the Beaumont disappearance. During the investigation, an informant named Mr. B claimed von Einem bragged about taking 3 children from a beach and conducting experiments on them. He said one child died during surgery, so von Einem killed the other 2 and dumped their bodies south of Adelaide. Von Einem resembled descriptions of the suspect from 1966. Mr. B also said von Einem talked about being involved in the Adelaide Oval kidnap from 1973, matching descriptions of the main suspect in that case. According to Adelaide Police Detective Bob O'Brien, Mr. B provided important information about the Kelvin murder investigation, but not all of it was trusted. Some details matched up, but others didn't quite fit the known facts about the Beaumont case. As of 2014, von Einem hadn't been ruled out as a suspect. Mr. B mentioned surgical experimentation similar to what was found in the coroner's reports on some of von Einem's alleged victims. Von Einem was known to hang around Glenelg Beach and had a thing for children, but he was younger than the suspect described in the Beaumont case. The Beaumont kids were also much younger than von Einem's usual targets. It's strange, but not impossible for a serial killer's methods to vary like this. The investigations into both the Beaumont disappearance and the Adelaide Oval kidnapping are still open. In 1989, von Einem was named as a suspect in a secret police report. In 2007, police were looking at old footage from the Beaumont search, hoping to identify a young man who looked like von Einem among the onlookers. Adelaide detective Bob O'Brien got info from Mr. B about Kelvin's murder, but not all of it was trusted. Some matched up, some didn't. As of 2014, von Einem wasn't ruled out as a suspect. Mr. B mentioned surgery stuff like what happened to von Einem's other victims. Von Einem hung around Glenelg Beach and liked kids, but he was younger than the suspect in the Beaumont case. The investigations into both cases are still open. Von Einem was a suspect in '89. Police looked at old footage from the Beaumont search in '7 to find someone who looked like von Einem. James O'Neill, born in 1947, is serving life in prison for a 1975 murder in Tasmania. He reportedly told people he was involved in the Beaumont disappearance. In 2006, he tried to stop an ABC documentary broadcast linking him to the case, but lost in court. Gordon Davey, a former detective, spent years talking to O'Neill. Though no evidence connects him to the Beaumont case, Davey believed he was guilty. When asked, O'Neill didn't deny involvement, but said he couldn't discuss it legally. O'Neill claims he never went to Adelaide, but his work took him near there. Davey also suspected O'Neill in the Adelaide Oval case. South Australia police interviewed O'Neill, but ruled him out as a suspect in the Beaumont case. Derek Percy, a convicted child murderer who died in 2013, was suggested as a suspect in the Beaumont case in a 2007 article in the Age newspaper. Cold case investigators found evidence linking him to several unsolved child murders. In his 1969 murder trial, Percy claimed insanity because he couldn't remember details of his actions. He thought he might have killed the Beaumont children because he was in the area but couldn't recall. Victoria police got permission to question him in 2007. However, Percy was only 17 in 1966, too young to match the suspect's description. It's unclear if he had access to a car then, which the suspect likely did for a quick getaway and disposal of the bodies. Percy was in prison from 1969 until his death in 2013, ruling him out as a suspect in the Adelaide Oval abductions. Alan Maxwell McIntyre, who passed away in 2017, once told the Adelaide Advertiser that a man he knew in 1966, later identified as Alan Anthony Monroe, came to his house with the Beaumont children's bodies in his car trunk. McIntyre's kids initially mistook one of the bodies for a boy because of her short hair. Monroe, a businessman and former scoutmaster, pleaded guilty to 10 child sex offenses from 1962. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, eligible for release in 2022. A child's diary from 1966 allegedly placed Monroe near Glenelg Beach when the Beaumont children disappeared. Monroe was convicted of abusing some children, including one of McIntyre's sons, who contributed to the diary, although Monroe was investigated before no evidence linked him to the Beaumont case. Harry Phipps, a local factory owner, became a suspect after the book The Satin Man was published in 2013. Phipps's son, Hayden, identified him as the Satin Man. Phipps resembled the man seen with the Beaumont children at Glenelg Beach. He was wealthy, gave out money, and lived close to the beach. Hayden claimed he saw the children in his father's yard on the day they disappeared. 2 others said Phipps paid them to dig a hole in his yard around that time. In 2013, part of Phipps's old factory was dug up, but no new evidence was found. In 2018, detectives returned for more digging, but only found animal bones and trash, nothing related to the Beaumont case. The Beaumont case is one of Australia's most famous unsolved mysteries. It led to one of the biggest police investigations in Australian history. Even after many years, it remains unsolved, but the police haven't given up. The government still offers a reward for information about the children's disappearance. This case changed how people watched over their kids in Australia. Before, it was common for kids to travel alone. But after this, and other similar crimes, people became more cautious. The Beaumont case, along with other crimes, marked a shift in Australian society. The media often talks about this case even decades later. New leads and clues come up, keeping the mystery alive in the public's mind. During the investigation, the Beaumont parents were widely supported by the Australian public. They stayed hopeful at their home in Somerton Park, especially Nancy, who believed their children might return. She feared the thought of them coming back and not finding their parents there. Over the years, as new leads and theories emerged, the Beaumonts cooperated, fully exploring every possibility. They endured claims that the children were taken by a religious cult and might be in New Zealand, Melbourne, or Tasmania. They also searched for any clues hinting at where the children might be buried. In 1990, newspapers upset the Beaumonts by publishing computer-made pictures of how their kids might look as adults. The pictures published without their permission made people feel sorry for them all over again. The Beaumont children's disappearance is a story that leaves you with more questions than answers. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the truth remains hidden. Despite years of searching and countless theories, Jane, Arna, and Grant have never been found. Their case serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of children and the enduring power of a mystery.